Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for showing up. This has been an interesting adventure. We've had non-stop little technical glitches. David Wilcock, a good friend of ours, has this term. He calls it negative greeting, which is that metaphysically, the amount of weird stuff that happens is kind of directly proportional to the impact that whatever you're going to try to do is going to have. So given on the basis that I've been locked in a hotel room with Robin feeding me under the door for the last 3 days, having to redo the entire presentation because of compatibility problems, tonight should be pretty interesting. First of all, I want to welcome my Facebook friends here. How many are here from Facebook? Oh my, good, good. And a lot of others, obviously, new friends, and you will obviously after the evening go on Facebook and join this extended global conversation. I mean, it's astonishing that the technology that we now have that is so important to moving politically what is going on forward did not exist when we started. I mean, I've been at this, 30 some years? If you want to technically count my time at CBS with Cronkite or CNN, it's been 40 some years learning or unlearning what NASA was not, that I thought back then it was. So this has been a very long road, winding up in Leeds in northern England in 2011, which, as you may find out later in the evening, it's even later than you think because it might actually be 2012 already. We'll get into that. What I want to talk about tonight is the demise or close down or transition of the American space program, something which has been viewed in many quarters with doom and gloom and horror and loathing and fear and all the other things that are going on now in media, and which, of course, I may have a somewhat different perspective on. We'll see as the evening goes forward. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to move swiftly through part one, which will be roughly 90 minutes, give or take. Then we'll give ourselves a 10-minute break so you can stretch your legs and get something to drink or whatever, because it's kind of warm in here. I'm told that English don't believe in air conditioning, which is kind of like the Italians. Robin and I went to Italy for a weekend to speak some years ago, and because it was after October 1, oh, we can't have air conditioning. You what? Oh, no, we don't. We turn off the air conditioning basically on October 1st. So we had a very warm reception in Italy. Very. Just about as warm here. And this room, of course, everybody is 800 and some BTUs, so you multiply by the number of people. If we can turn up the fans or turn up the air, anything, because it will get warm by the end of the evening. Not the least of which is maybe perchance what I'm going to say. What I want to talk about is, among other things, this. The real story behind El-Anin. And because I'm going to tease you madly, that's going to be at the end of the second half. Because you won't understand and appreciate all that's gone into this phenomenon unless you hear the first half and a good part of the beginning of the second half. Then we're also going to talk about this. This is NASA's absolutely astonishing visit to Vesta. Who would have thought that a little gal named Vesta, who is the goddess of the fire and the hearth and home, would have the potential to transform not just NASA, which is now there, orbiting every few hours with a spacecraft called magically Dawn, a spacecraft name which is not bereft of symbology of the kind that you're kind of used to me talking about. And then after we get through with all that, we're going to talk about the secret space program. You know, guys are kind of competitive, so if Dolan talked to you about this afternoon, the secret space program, I'm going to show you what's underneath that layer. The rabbit hole, as they say, goes very deep, Alice, very deep. So with that as prelude, let us begin. This remarkable photograph, which was taken from the space station just a few days ago, is the descending arc, the reentry of the Space Shuttle Atlantis, the last space shuttle of the last 30 years of NASA's Space Shuttle program, which was prescinding from the previous amazing human spaceflight program of the United States called the Apollo program, which went boldly where no one for a very, very, very long time had gone before, namely to and from the moon. And yes, Alice, we did go to and from the moon. In fact, I was there when the story that we didn't was being cooked up at NASA, at JPL, that July week, that amazing week in 1969. And of course, it was only in hindsight, decades later, that I kind of figured out what it was I was seeing. Because back then, we were so naive. We didn't have a clue as to what was really going on, and the layers and the depth of this rabbit hole and how far down it goes, and what things have been concealed for what reasons for how long. Hopefully now we are wiser. This mission, this last mission of Atlantis, as it landed, can we kind of bring these lights down? I saw the circuit breakers pop up, what do they call those things? They're automatic dimmers, they're on motors. We really need to kill them. Yeah, so, because you're going to want to see some of this stuff in very good contrast. It's not something I did, was it?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. One never knows. Anyway, when the shuttle landed, when Atlantis came back at dawn a few weeks ago, it landed on this runway trailing this bright, humid, turbulent vortex flow of Florida air behind it for the very last time. And no sooner had it landed and rolled to a stop than the headlines began loudly proclaiming the end of a voyage and the end of an era. And in fact, they also talked about the end of everything. The fact that with the end of the shuttle program, NASA's future was then and is now, in terms of mainstream perception, incredibly uncertain. Well, tonight I'm hoping to give you a window, a preview of what we have tried to figure out in terms of what's really going on. Because behind the scenes, we are being prepared, I believe, and I think I can substantiate it with real data, some phenomenal advances and discoveries and announcements that between now and the end of the year have the potential, finally. Is Steve Bassett here? Steve here? Okay. Stephen's ship is about to come in. We are going to have the D word, disclosure. It is on track. It is projectable. It is, as you will see by the end of the evening, if it doesn't happen, something so amazing will have taken its place that in fact it's just as if it does happen. And that will all become clear as the evening goes on. Now, the shuttle program has a very interesting history, which is in fact involved with this D word, disclosure. This is a view at Cape Canaveral decades ago, 3 decades ago, 30-some years, showing a comparison between the amazing workhorse of the Apollo program, the Saturn V, where if you ever saw one of these things lift off, your life would never be the same. It was and still remains, the mightiest rocket ever built, the mightiest movable engine humans have ever created in this modern era, and it was quietly moved aside when, for reasons that will become clearer as the evening progresses, the decision was made to come back from the moon and stay home. And instead of going boldly where no one had gone before, beyond the moon, to Mars, to the asteroids, to the outer planets, to inherit the solar system, as my friend Kraft Ericke wrote so splendidly in a book called The Magnificent Heritage, at a time when he could not get it published at NASA in the United States. This is the early 70s, as the shuttle program was just beginning and Apollo was now history. He literally had to go to the Soviet Union. Remember, this was at the height of the Cold War, to get a book about inheriting and using the resources for the benefit of all mankind that are out there. And of course, what he was writing about is nothing compared to the resources that we can show to you tonight that are really waiting for all of humankind. It was into that political milieu that this remarkable vehicle first made the scene. Because instead of doing what this did, this incredible vehicle, this Saturn V, the emblematic symbol of American prowess and power and technological mastery and the ability to overcome obstacles and come from behind and ultimately win the ultimate race to the moon. This place, we decided as a nation, as a culture, to come back from this astonishing tour de force, which I was so fortunate to have been able to participate in through the offices of this individual, an old friend, an old colleague, no longer with us now, Walter Cronkite, who at that time was called the most trusted man in America. I worked with Walter for, maybe half a decade? Not continuously, but off and on during missions and preparations, and then as the shuttle the Apollo program wound down and the shuttle took over. And he was a phenomenal guy to work for because he taught me several things. He taught me what journalism really is, which is not about listening to a source. It's about comparing sources, independent information coming from different directions, weighing and balancing and judging on the veracity and the credibility of the people who are talking to you, while at the same time he would sit by the pool in Florida week after week after week during these mission run-ups as we were getting ready for the broadcast, and he would read huge, thick tomes that I and others would prepare for him, the so-called briefing books, so he could have literally taken the Apollo spacecraft apart and almost put it back together himself. In fact, he loved doing that. This is one of the TV shots where he was talking about how the Apollo command module separates from the service module and how they would turn around and use the force of the rockets to slow down going into lunar orbit, and all kinds of technology that a news guy was not supposed to be privy to. Well, he was the hardest working, most interesting journalist I could have possibly learned from. And one of the things I learned from him is there are layers to stories. The first story you get is not necessarily the right one. Little did I know how deep, as I said a moment ago, the rabbit hole vis-a-vis NASA is and extends. I should have probably had a clue, because when we weren't on the air and when we weren't, talking in terms of professional presentations and putting together copy and broadcasts and all that, a lot of the guys covering the space program kept talking about NASA, the acronym NASA, as short for never a straight answer. And at the time, I was 23. Why in the world are they saying this? This is NASA. Now I know. So we had this astonishing adventure, all of us, 3 million plus 300 million plus friends. About 1 billion people watched Apollo 11 land on the moon on that amazing night in 1969, July 20th. Again, a date, a moment in time that I did not understand the significance of until many, many decades later. July 20th was obviously not picked by accident, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then we had this phenomenal years between 69, 70, 71, with a hiatus because of the almost tragedy of Apollo 13, picking up through the end of the program, Apollo 17, again, a number which is significant that I didn't realize at the time. NASA was picking these numbers, these dates, these times, the names for the missions, the mission, all of this had an unseen backstory that not even Cronkite, I believe, would ever have believed. Because what we saw, what we covered, what we put out for the American people, and by metonymy, the rest of the world, because remember, there were only 3 broadcast networks back then. CNN didn't exist, Fox didn't exist, there was ABC, CBS, and NBC, and in many of the years of coverage, we actually, on certain programs, we collaborated. We actually shared staff. It was called a pool. I became an advisor for Jules Bergman over at ABC because we wanted to cover an eclipse. Well, there were all of us on this Air Force plane in 1970 in March, chasing an eclipse, the so-called eclipse of the century. Networks love to give big, classy titles to their coverage. So there was the eclipse of the century, the this of the century, the that of the century. And I wound up working for Jules Bergman, who was a very hard worker, but he was totally temperamentally different. Radically different than Cronkite. Whereas, if I could use a racehorse analogy, where Walter was a fine thoroughbred. Jay, I'm sorry, my ABC friend was, Jules I'm talking about, was definitely a skittish colt. He actually was angling to be the first news guy to go into space. And he almost made it. It's really kind of a tragedy that he didn't, live long enough to actually do that. But he wanted to, and the astronauts and NASA treated him with great deference because he was much younger than Walter, and he wanted to go. And if things had worked out a little differently, he might have gone boldly where no newsmen had ever gone. And then in '72, in December of '72, with this mission, this is the actual stills from the video of the last mission to leave the moon, Apollo 17, the Challenger lunar module commanded by Gene Cernan. And after it lifted off from the lunar surface, viewed by a remote-controlled TV camera run by a guy named N. Findell down there in Houston with a second and a half time lag between sending the commands and getting confirmation back at the speed of light that the camera had actually moved, gimbaled and elevated and panned and tilted properly. That was the end of Apollo. That was the final moment of our incredible effort to go to and from the moon in modern history. And even as that last mission was leaving, some months before, these two gentlemen had gotten together at a place called San Clemente. The guy on the right is Richard Nixon. He was then President of the United States. The guy on the left was Jim Fletcher. He was then head of NASA. And as you can see, Jim Fletcher is showing the President this weird, ungainly contraption, which was going to not go to the moon, but instead, hopefully, it was projected, drastically cut the price of space travel to where ordinary folks like me, like you, like Bergman, could go into space at much less cost per pound than the Saturn V or any previously contemplated vehicle designed to leave and return to the Earth safely. The space shuttle, or as they called it technically, the Space Transportation System. Well, that story as to how the shuttle evolved has many twists and turns. But this is a morning in January of, I think, 1977, because it took from 72 to 77 for the spacecraft to actually be developed, to be constructed, to be rolled out officially, and we'll get to that in a moment, and then to be trekked up several tens of miles from Palmdale to Edwards Air Force Base, where it was going to be tested on the back of a 747 in a series of what they called approach and landing tests like this, where it was literally ferried into the air, carried up to 40,000 feet. They cut the switches, the latches or explosive bolts actually fired. The shuttle was released, and then it simulated those last few terrifying minutes of a glider, which had all the aerodynamic qualities of a brick. I mean, this thing, like Neil Armstrong said many years later of the astronauts, that they were like parrots. They didn't fly very well. A reference with multi-leveled meanings, as some of you may understand. This thing was not designed really as an airplane. That was its final few seconds, coming back and landing on a runway. Its real mission, its real environment, its real place where it loved to be was 200 miles upstairs in space. And it left on a rocket and it came back as a glider. And believe me, as a glider, it was harrowing because it came in much more steeply than any commercial aircraft. Its sink rate was hundreds of feet per second, and they had only one shot. If they didn't land it, and landed perfectly the first time, there was no going around for a second time. And back in those days, 30 years ago, all this was brand new. All this was like really interesting, and we talked among ourselves, those guys who covered the missions, would you go up on that thing? No going around, one shot? And to a man, sorry, we're all guys, we would have given anything to go. I mean, anything. Up until Challenger. And then some had second and third thoughts. Here's the actual shuttle drifting free over Edwards, over those marvelous western deserts. If you look really carefully, you can see that she has a name. She's called Enterprise. And the story of Enterprise directly involves my dear departed friend, Gene Roddenberry. Because by the luck of the draw, by some bizarre circumstance of time and life and history and however the universe is put together, I found myself at a meeting in Washington about a year before this flight with George Takei and a whole bunch of Star Trek fans for a weekly meeting that a bunch of us had in the suburbs of Washington. May have been Silver Spring, I don't know, it was one of those suburbs. And what we were discussing was the future of the space program. And a friend of mine who was a policy advisor named Jerome Glenn, happened that afternoon to have a meeting with President Ford in the Oval Office in the White House. That was his job. He was a policy guy. He was a policy wonk, as the term goes. But he was also a friend of mine, and we agreed to kind of meet at this meeting and then go and have dinner or something. So he came into the meeting and he kind of sat there like the resident alien, and he listened to us for a while, and he kind of looked around and he said, well, I just came from the White House and they're looking to name this thing in a few weeks. Actually, it was more like 6 months. What if you were to try to give it a name? And the reason that he proposed this is because he and I had long discussions about the amazing problem that NASA was having, in that the budgets were cut back and contractors were laid off and people didn't seem to really understand what space was about, even after Apollo. They got, oh, another boring mission to the moon, like, give me a break. But a lot of people felt that way. More now, probably, than then, a lot more, unfortunately. And so we were looking, and part of our discussion that evening was, how could we inject the kind of enthusiasm in the real space program that Gene had injected into this mythical program? Starfleet, the Federation, a ship called Enterprise. So we all looked at each other, and I said, well, what if we were to name it Enterprise? And there was this silence, and George Takei said, oh, what a nice idea. And that was the beginning of the Enterprise campaign, which I told Gene this is what we're going to do. I called him up and I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get the President of the United States to overrule NASA, who wanted to call this first shuttle Constitution. Boring. Because what we were trying to do as this ragtag band of insurgents and revolutionaries was to get people involved, to give them something in the American program, in the NASA program, that they could call their own. What better, we thought, than to name the first ship of this new era of space that ultimately would wind up in the projections in those days of slashing the cost of getting into orbit and down to where teachers and business guys and journalists and me could go boldly where no one. So we looked at each other and we said, okay, now how do we do this? And it turned out that in our extended family, some of us knew a gal named B. Joe Trimble, who had been the mastermind of the letter writing campaign, which had literally, with some help from some of us in that room, me included, another long story I won't get into tonight, had actually been able to get NBC to keep Star Trek on the air when NBC said, the ratings gods, oh, it's not doing well, get rid of it, get rid of it. Let's bring on, the Ponder or some, whatever they wanted to bring on, okay? And we said, you must keep Star Trek on the air, and we actually convinced the network with a major letter writing campaign spearheaded by B. Joe Trimble to keep Star Trek right on NBC. So we said to each other, well, if we did it then, couldn't we not do it again? This time for something for real, a stake in the real. So we started the Star Trek letter writing campaign. And Werner von Braun's assistant at that time was a friend of mine, a school teacher from Delaware named Carol Rosin. I think you may have heard the name Carol Rosin, because she has been the one talking of late, over many years, of what von Braun was telling her about false flag operations, terrorism, asteroids, aliens, et cetera, that certain powers that be have envisioned to basically hornswoggle all the rest of us and keep the fear-mongering going really big. Well, he and she had that conversation decades ago, but at that time, I didn't know any about that. All I knew was that she was going to give us access, with his permission, to Fairchild's phones. They were up in Germantown, which is a suburb right outside Washington. And we, in those days, remember, no internet, no Twitter, no Facebook, no nothing. It was a phone or it was a letter. That was how you communicated. We had free phones courtesy of Fairchild Industry, and we trekked back and forth, and we manned the phones, dozens of us sitting there like a telethon, calling people all over the country to marshal the letters, to get people to write letters to the President of the United States and to NASA, requesting very respectfully, not demanding, but requesting, as American citizens, as taxpayers, that in fact the first space shuttle, the kickoff of this amazing new era, take on the emblematic name Enterprise. What was it Picard said? Never let history forget the name Enterprise. We lived it. We believed it then, and as you can see, because of this, the thing that I now run, kind of, we believe it now. So, time moved on. The reason this graphic shows NASA looming over the White House is because NASA had extraordinary power in Washington then, and it does now. I now understand where that power comes from, but at that time we were so naive, we just felt that, well, NASA actually worked for the president, so the president, if he wanted to overrule NASA and call it something more intriguing than the Constitution, he would certainly be able to do so. So we began the campaign, appealing to Gerald Ford, who was fighting his own campaign that summer, the summer of '76, to not let Ronald Reagan take the presidency away from him, because he, remember, had been appointed to replace Nixon, and this was going to be his first campaign for his own shot at the White House in the fall of 1976, the bicentennial summer and fall. So that entire summer, as I went west to cover the first Viking landing on the moon, on Mars rather, which the reason I get the two confused is because it turned out that it was the same date that we landed an unmanned Viking spacecraft on Mars that we had landed on the moon, July 20th. Didn't have a clue then why NASA somehow got that coincidence going. Of course, we do now. In the meantime, my friend Jerry Glenn had asked us to prepare a white paper. You can't do policy in Washington without preparing a white paper. So we prepared a white paper for the President of the United States, researching and putting on paper all of the ships of the line, the enterprises going back through American history, all the way back to UK history, where almost by chance, but maybe not really, the first of all the new vessels which had taken to the seas from before the Revolutionary War wound up being called Enterprise. And there was the Brigantine Enterprise in the Revolutionary War. Moving forward, there was the U.S. Aircraft Enterprise, which was the fighting lady who almost, without her, we may not have won World War II. There was then, in a much more modern era, in the 50s and 60s, the first nuclear aircraft carrier, the Enterprise, which is depicted here. This, by the way, is the work of a guy named John Eves, who was an art director, a designer, a brilliant artist who did all these sketches for the Enterprise TV show. I want to give him proper credit. And then on July 20th, on that amazing dawn of 1976, as Roddenberry and I are sitting in the front row in the Von Karman Auditorium, and I'm wearing that terrible haircut and that awful suit, because we all wore those stupid things back then. Oh, that history could quietly erase that from memory. In Washington, slowly through the labyrinth of policy and the White House mailroom and NASA machinations behind the scene, and NASA people actually going out to Star Trek conventions saying, "You can't do this, it's un-American, you have no right to take this." I mean, they actually argued on the record that American citizens did not have the right to appeal to their government to overrule NASA and to name this ship Enterprise. People paid by NASA. In fact, I can give you the name of the guy who was leading the charge. His name was Jesko von Puttkamer, a Nazi, a real Nazi. Now I understand why Jesko not only hated the idea, but got me in his little beady sights and took a real bead on me and ultimately convinced Roddenberry that I should not be named science advisor to the first Star Trek film. Because if they did that, NASA would withdraw all support and Gene wouldn't get a dime or any use of hardware or facilities in the making of the movie that he had wanted to make for a generation, the first major Star Trek film. That's how vindictive NASA was then, and still can be, politically, if you cross their path the wrong way. So, in September, as Eric Burgess and I are making our way back and forth from the Valley, where I was staying with him that incredible Viking summer, covering the first unmanned landing on Mars, the most extraordinary unmanned mission of our lifetime, where we came within a whisker of proving that life exists on Mars even now. And in hindsight, of course, we now know that all the conversations that I watched take place and all the bizarre things that made no sense make perfect sense, because NASA was in the process of actively covering up that Viking had discovered life on Mars by changing the rules in mid-flight. Each of those experiments on that Viking mission turned up positive results for life, and NASA resolutely and forthrightly decried and eschewed and denied any of those results and said it was all just, ready? Funny chemistry. Yeah, really funny chemistry. In the meantime, tracked by my friend Jerry Glenn, on a September afternoon, kind of, I think it was first week in September, something like that, at the crack of dawn at Eric's house, I get a phone call. And Eric comes knocking on the door. Richard, Dick, you got a phone call from Washington. So I stumble over to the phone, because in those days, even extensions in various rooms was something that wasn't normal. I go down to the kitchen, pick up the phone. Yeah. Jerry said, he did it. I said, what? What? He said, he did it. He named the damn thing Enterprise. And this is how it looked. This is the only photograph in the entire NASA archive of the space shuttle being officially handled by the President of the United States, Jerry Ford, being shown and demonstrated by Dr. Fletcher. And it is a lousy picture. I tried my best to clean it up. It's the one little shot, maybe 20 pixels across in the NASA archive online, because NASA hated the idea that it was going to be Enterprise. Because, as Jared B. from one of the fanzines called Trekdom says, faced with a deluge of trekkers, President Gerald Ford casually remarked to NASA Chief Fletcher in late afternoon, I'm a little partial to the name Enterprise. Ford did not mention the letters or petitions. Instead, he claimed that he liked the name because he'd served aboard a Navy ship that serviced an aircraft carrier by that name. Talk about political gymnastics. Fletcher objected, which of course we knew he would, and Jerry Ford, to his everlasting credit, overruled him. I have a feeling that there was more going on behind the scenes than just the letters. Because, as you're going to hear later on in the evening, Jerry Ford was a Mason. Gene Roddenberry was a Mason. Masons are crucial in our unfolding tale, as you are going to see. Masons, in fact, the real ones, not the fake ones, are the good guys. And obviously, Jerry Ford and Gene Roddenberry shared an ideal, which was how to use this to democratize humankind's faint toehold in space. And Ford didn't have a moon program, but he did have control of something called a shuttle. And so he overruled Fletcher, and thereby the first space shuttle in history was called Enterprise. Now we flash forward the film. Remember how Ford didn't want to even identify with Star Trek or say that it was anything to do with the letters or the fans? Well, we now have a president, his name is Barack Obama, and he can really do the Spock, Vulcan salute like no president I've ever seen. In fact, there's a lot of, remember that film called The Music Man where, forget the name of the actor, Robert Preston. He talked about, you got to be careful because you'll see certain words and lingo creeping into your kids' vocabulary like whiz bang and what. Well, Obama drops Star Trek references all the time. And no one gets it. No one understands, and I hope you will by the end of the evening, that in fact this is not an accident. This is part of a much longer game plan. And there have been bumps in the road and all kinds of other stuff that's gone on over the last 3 years. But by and large, that game plan now appears to be on track to some amazing, astonishing things. And yes, Steve, we're on the edge of forever. So in 1976, on that sunny September afternoon, I think it was September 17th, Gene, here in one of these stupid leisure suits, and most of the crew, except for Bill Shatner, who never showed up for any of these things, stood there. There's, DeForest Kelley talking with Dr. Fletcher, who, of course, is gritting his teeth because he didn't want this thing named Enterprise. And there's a lot of people, I mean, look how young Walter Koenig looks. He's the only guy that looks like he's really enjoying himself. Everybody else looks, there's Nichelle, all right? This huge, amazing spaceship that was going to take us all where no one had gone before was in fact named Enterprise. And the band played, and she rolled out of the hangar, and people stood up and they cheered, and here's, Leonard and George and DeForest and Scotty Doohan. Household names from a different century, a vision of a future that everybody could identify with, where it didn't matter whether you were black or white or a woman or Asian or a commie. You could get along and you could make amazing things happen and boldly go together for the benefit of all humankind. The Federation, a confederation of different cultures and backgrounds and races who in fact shared one dream, which was to find out what's out there and then to use it for the benefit of everyone. That was Gene's vision. That was what we hoped we could instill in this ship as a template for things to come. How naive we were. How incredibly naive. But it did have a very interesting legacy in ways that I could not have foreseen. One guy who really got impressed with what we pulled off was this guy. Because all the rest of his career with Star Trek, up until he tragically and prematurely died of a stroke in 1991, Enterprise and the idea there was a synthesis of reality and fiction, that it was basically life imitating art and art imitating life, almost in like an Ouroboros with a snake eating its tail, where you can't tell where one begins and the other ends. And we can define the future by our dreams. That became so much a part of his own mythology. Here's a shot from the Star Trek film, which I did not wind up being a science advisor on because of politics at NASA. This is one of the chief characters. She ultimately winds up melding with V'ger and going, in very exotic places together with her lover and the second officer of the Enterprise. But there's a scene where he's showing her, as an alien coming aboard the ship for the first time, the sequence of historical references to the enterprises that have existed before. And right there, after the brigantine and the aircraft carrier that Gerald Ford didn't serve on, but he served on a ship that was next to her, there is the Enterprise, right there on the recreation deck of the mythical starship, carrying everyone's hopes and dreams into a future that Gene felt we could have if enough of us simply demanded, like we demanded that she get this name. It was supposed to be a symbolic victory for ordinary folks, and it became a victory at levels that you cannot imagine because, of course, the Enterprise mission itself is named after this very important moment in history. This now is another set of photos, again from John Eves. Those sketches I showed you before were the sketches that graced the walls of Archer's Ready Room in the umpteenth series extension of the franchise on television. Again, Gene was so impressed that somehow a bunch of Trekkies had gotten together. And as John Everhart, my friend of Science News, said, the only difference between Trekkies, and he kept using the word Trekkie, not Trekker, the Trekkies and space people, otherwise, citizens, taxpayers, is that the Trekkies figured out that if they demanded something from their government, they might actually get it. And yes, they and we did. Well, of course, Gene carried this into the films. This is the Brigantine Enterprise. And a very funny scene that plays out in the film where Worf is supposed to jump off the plank and get his hat, his officer's hat. And no one has ever made this jump before, and he lands successfully. And I think Data is the one that says, remove the plank, as opposed to retract the plank. And so the holographic computer simply makes the plank disappear, and Worf falls in the water. Gene had stunning fun with this metaphor over and over again. Enterprise, here and now and then. And I'm sure you're going to see it come back again and again because it's timeless. It actually now forevermore, because of all of us, those of us that have this dream, it is anchored in a reality that can, I firmly believe, if we take that spirit and move it in the direction you're going to see later in the evening, can affect the future positively once again, because stunning new tools are presenting themselves for political action and political perspicacity. This, of course, is a chart of the 30 years of the shuttle's history, showing its beginnings. There are all kinds of mission patches here. The shuttle was instrumental in building several huge technological feats in space, like the space station. It lofted the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit. It serviced the Mir as a prelude to the space station. It had 135 missions. It extended 30 years. Many of the spacecraft have fabled, iconic, incredibly symbolic names, such as Atlantis, such as Enterprise, such as Endeavour, or Discovery. And this, of course, are a few shots from the last mission. This is it approaching the space station, which is this is a device in orbit that humans have built, like the von Braun vision, where we'd take up chunks and chunks and chunks and you'd assemble them with men and women outside in spacesuits with spanners and bolts and drills that were converted into bolt, fasteners. All kinds of tools. The art form of manufacturing, assembling human things in space, had never been done and would never have been possible if it hadn't been for the shuttle. So if we are poised on the edge, as I hope to show you, of going boldly a lot farther now than we have gone before, without the 30 years of doing this, without the 30 years of building these things in orbit, we wouldn't have things like this. We wouldn't have the expertise, the knowledge base. We wouldn't be able to assemble the expeditions that will carry, again, with conventional technology. No Star Trek drives, no hyperdimensional physics need apply yet. If we simply put to use what we already know how to do, that we have done over the last couple of generations, then the future, the revolution which is going to come, will arrive full-born, because what's out there, if we can get there, is going to be, if it not already tonight is, as you're going to see, the game changer which changes all of future history. And without that 30 years of the shuttle, which I have myself denigrated publicly, calling it basically a truck that went around and around and around and around, it kept us politically and technologically and financially trapped in low Earth orbit, as it was designed to do 30-some years ago, I now fully understand. But the one positive thing it did, it gave us the time to develop the expertise to, when the politics all magically arrived at the same moment, we could then take flight and use that expertise to go places that are almost unimaginable by ordinary men and women watching television or watching CNN or the BBC. And we're poised, as I will show you later on tonight, on that threshold. And that threshold is literally only weeks or at most months away if the dots that I'm going to connect, in fact, continue, as they certainly appear to be doing. So with the end of the shuttle, we are left with this symbolic question. This is another one of the stunning shots from the last 30 years. The shuttle silhouetted against, as Ben Franklin was asked one day at the Continental Congress, is it sunrise or is it sunset? Is it the beginning of something or is it the end of something? What we do from here, all of us who are here tonight and all of us who watch this on television, what we collectively do, like all those 400,000 people in the pre-internet era who wrote, according to the Washington Post, to NASA and the White House and demanded something of their government, and for God's sake, they got it. If we do the same, given the tools that are now available to us, what cannot be done? And the Enterprise herself? Well, she's going to New York. She's going to become part of the Intrepid Air and Space Museum in the harbor of New York. It'd been better if she went to San Francisco, a little more, you know, that's where the Enterprise in Gene's mythology was built. But I'll settle for New York. A lot more people are going to see her there and hopefully get in the spirit of what we were able to accomplish in the real world by holding out a dream. But the mainstream press guys love to ask really dumb questions, like, does NASA have a future? After all that it's done, all the amazing things, even in the mainstream that it's shown us, they ask, does NASA have a future? There were all kinds of headlines. You know, NASA's future in doubt, era ends, ex-NASA official believes shuttle could endanger future missions. NASA withers for want of vision. Well, the problem is the road has now become very complicated, kind of bumpy. It is not the unending road that we envisioned in our naive days back when Kennedy announced we were going to the moon. Things are so much more layered. And we in this room know that things are much more layered than the mainstream knows. So this vision of the shuttle going to and from orbit, building this space station, which could be used as a jumping off place in some visions for going back to here or even beyond. That is all in doubt because of certain political things that happened from this presidency on. At the middle of the Bush administration in 2004, as the marker between his first term and his second term had come to an end and was then being reborn in the second term, out of nowhere, the president went to NASA headquarters and suddenly announced that we were going to go back to the moon in something called Project Constellation. And Mike Griffin, who was then head of NASA, conceived this very expensive, very complex, very elaborate, and totally unrealistic, and I think it was by design, way of going back to the moon called the Constellation Program, which included 2 rockets, one to launch astronauts, one to launch heavy lift cargo, and this behemoth would have been bigger and like 10 times more expensive either to build or to operate than the Saturn V. We didn't have a prayer financially with where the country was going because of all the other things the president was doing with the budget, including wars, tax cuts, driving up the deficit to astronomical proportions in a matter of years. No one who knew anything looked at this and said it has a prayer, except the visionaries, the people who really thought it was going to lead someday to what we'd all been hoping for, which was bases on the moon. The ability in 1/6 gravity in a dome like this to put on, as Isaac Asimov used to write about, a pair of wings and, like Icarus, actually fly on the moon. You can do that because of 1/6 gravity. If you have a roughly air density of this room, you can, with human-powered muscles, you can fly like Icarus over a landscape and land by yourself gently. That's only one of many things you can do on the moon. So when the president came into office, President Obama, all of us looked eagerly with great anticipation, what's he going to do with NASA? What's he going to do with Constellation? We had all kinds of clues that he, in fact, was going to aggressively accelerate this vision. But instead, on April 15th of 2010, he announced he was canceling the missions back to the moon. He was ushering in a new era of transferring NASA operations to and from the space station to commercial space flight carriers, people like Elon Musk. And he was going to not go anywhere, not to announce any destination. He, in fact, was simply going to, on the recommendations of a second Augustine Commission, go with what was called a flexible path, which politically means he ain't going nowhere. And NASA and even people like George Norrie are carping at me constantly about how NASA has no future. Without a destination, I mean, I felt this way myself until I realized that there are many ways to play four-dimensional chess, particularly if someone has told you that you should not leave Earth, that the human race, in fact, should stay home, which at the lower level down of the politics of this appears to be, as I can document, what is driving the train. Obama's visions when he came into office in many arenas appear to have been changed by other factors. And unless you know what those factors are, things just look weird and muddled and visionless and goalless. And the bottom line is there are hidden agendas at play right now, that are trying to divert what I believe I can show is in fact coming. One of the pieces of good news is that one of your countrymen here, and there are probably a lot of you British guys here and gals, Richard Branson has in fact undertaken flight tests in New Mexico. In a few short months, he's going to be taking his first actual passengers on suborbital flights into space. It costs $200,000 a pop, but there's a lot of people that apparently have, you know, all those hedge fund managers for one thing, who can afford 200 grand, not even miss it. If it takes those kinds of people getting excited, like those of us that named the Enterprise, to put the new zing in people going into space, so instead of an elite group of supermen, the astronauts and astro women, in fact, it's just us. Anybody, you know, it would pass what my old friend Harry Stein used to call the Stein's grandmother test, to where you can actually get on an airplane even in your 80s. I was talking to Barbara Marx Hubbard the other night about this. I said, Barbara, if you want to go to space, because she expressed on the air, we've known each other decades. I said, if you want to go on into space, Branson will probably take you. And so we're quietly setting some things in motion, and we're going to see if an 81-year-old grandmother actually can pass the Stein's grandmother test, which is she can get on this thing, this amazing, I mean, doesn't it look like a spaceship, a spacecraft? Oh, and one other little thing. Sir Richard Branson became my everlasting friend when he decided to call her Enterprise, the first of the line. We started something, and together we're going to finish what we started. And a guy who's helping us in ways that are not apparent, but I believe if our projections are accurate, will become quite apparent to a lot of people very soon, is this guy. What he's doing here is signing the 2011 NASA appropriation bill, actually the entire federal budget, but NASA was included in the appropriation. And under that appropriation, several key elements of Bush's program to go back to the moon and on to Mars and any other place in the solar system with chemical rocket propulsion is in fact quietly being undertaken even as we're here tonight. For instance, the spacecraft that would take astronauts to and from the moon, which by the way is called Orion, thereby hangs a very long tail. That spacecraft is being built by Lockheed Martin. It will be ready by the time that the vehicle that will carry it into orbit is in fact made, tested, and launched and ready for human occupants, which I'll get to in a minute. Orion, as you will see, this is the constellation of Orion, which is hundreds of light years from the Earth. In fact, all these stars are not the same distance. This is the famed Orion Nebula. These are the belt stars of Orion. This is Betelgeuse, Rigel, Bellatrix, and Scythe, I believe is the name of this one. This constellation is somehow emblematic for NASA. And if you read Dark Mission, you understand exactly what this really represents. Because it turns out that this constellation, Orion, was the centerpiece of the entire Apollo program. If you want to read the book and understand the symbology that NASA's been telling us all these years without telling us at all, you might want to check out Dark Mission. Because constellation, nice generic name, well, what constellation are they talking about? They're talking about Orion. This very interesting aeroform. People have been debating for decades. What did NASA mean? Is it something from, wind tunnel testing? Is it something from NASA's NACA roots when it was developing aircraft technology back in the 20s and 30s? You can see it here in the NASA logo. We call it the meatball. And after a brief fling with something more modern in the 1970s, NASA, thank goodness, with a new administrator, I forget who it was, decided to return to the classic meatball of the beginnings of NASA back during the era of going to the moon. Again, this aeroform, this swooped, streamlined, whatever this is, well, it's this. I'm sorry, we go this way. It is an A. It's a stylized A, which stands in Egyptian for Asar, which is the Egyptian name for Osiris, which is, of course, Orion. Symbol, symbol, symbols. I have said many times before that NASA can't do anything, even to go down the hall to the men's room, without a ritual. And that is not an overstatement, as you are going to see. So what is it that secretly Obama is doing that nobody seems to understand because he's deliberately not talking about what he's doing? He was able, through very clever, crafty politics, to get in a time of incredible dissension. As you can see, if you watch the recent debt debate on television, either on Sky News or BBC or even on CNN, that Republicans and Democrats cannot agree on anything. Absolutely anything. The polarization is driving our nation apart. It's doing it in many other places, but it is doing it on live television from Washington in our country. That polarization obtains on no matter how trivial the bill, how trivial the legislation, how trivial what you'd think should be just de rigueur and appropriated automatically, like the debt ceiling was automatically increased because if you don't pay your bills, you wind up losing your credit rating, as the United States, because of this debacle, has now done. We've been downgraded from AAA to AA by one of the major rating agencies, all because they say they didn't simply do what they'd done in years before, and they raised doubts in the minds of creditors. Well, if you read Joseph Farrell's work, you know the banksters rule the world. And this, I believe, was done deliberately as part of a process to delegitimize the United States and what is about to happen and in the future in history which is about to come. We'll see whether it works, whether the other plans of the other side are going to actually take the field and win. And we're not going to know for several weeks, if maybe a year or two, if in fact other things are going to restore a United States that we in the U.S. can be proud of, or whether in fact we are going to wind up devaluing the dollar, wind up, panhandling like the 30s out in the streets looking for, whatever work we can get, et cetera, et cetera. Someone appears politically to have tried to program that track into our future history in direct contravention to some of the things I'm going to talk about in part 2 of what we're going to talk about tonight. But in the meantime, behind the scenes, this is what Obama's planning, because as part of that NASA appropriation bill that you saw him signing, in the only thing in Washington that Republicans and Democrats, since he was elected, could agree on, they all agreed to increase and to fund a legitimate NASA program after the shuttle, which includes this: a huge monster rocket which will be able to carry 130 metric tons to and from orbit almost the equivalent of the old Saturn V. And that together with Orion, in fact, I can show you the comparison here. Here's the Saturn V, here's the heavy lift version of the follow-on vehicle. The thing that makes it really affordable, even under the current budget extremists, is that it will be mostly derived from reassembling the technology, the 30-year-old proven technology of the Space Shuttle program, which of course is what Bush claimed he was doing, and Mike Griffin came in and completely designed a totally new rocket. Expanded the width, changed the height, changed all the fittings, the engines and everything. Well, a lot of that money that was put into that program is going to be used in the new program, which doesn't even have a name. That's how low-key and under the radar it is. This is, if I'm right, four-dimensional chess, because with that vehicle, as Robert Heinlein used to say, once you're in Earth orbit, you're halfway to anywhere. I know that chemical rockets are primitive, and they're dumb, and they're expensive, and they're unreliable, and they break, and they kill people. But in the open literature, in the open space programs, notwithstanding the secret space program, we're going to talk about in a while, they're the only thing we got. But they're the only thing we need. Because if this can be put together in the way that Obama is quietly envisioning in this bill, with this architecture, as it's called, a space architecture, with all the bits and pieces being quietly developed, very quietly, so there's no headlines in CNN, no big stories being written in the New York Times, no profiles in aviation, in space technology. If this all comes together the way it appears to, within less time, like a few years, 3 or 4 years, compared to the transition between the Apollo program and the shuttle program, which was almost 10 years. It was 9 years from the time the last Apollo mission landed, Apollo 17 in the Pacific Ocean, and the first shuttle in 1981 left from Cape Canaveral, with me as a witness, with me standing there, ultimately pressed into service as an advisor to CNN to cover the first shuttle mission 30 years ago. Now, instead of almost a decade between human spaceflight, American human spaceflight programs, we're down to just a few years. By 2014, 15, 16, that time frame, this new vehicle will be ready to send American astronauts, not to the space station. That's going to be handled by people like Elon Musk and others like even Branson someday. But this is going to go back to the moon. The only thing that is missing, because all the pieces are on the board, the only thing missing is gas in the car, which in Washington, of course, is money. How in an era of incredible, financial extremists, with budget slashing, with deficits on the minds of everybody and the lips of every news guy, with headlines talking about, oh, we're spending too much money, we got to cut back. How is NASA ever going to get the necessary funds to make this happen? That's where we come to part 2. Because if what I think is going to happen happens in the next 6 months, and you're going to see a lot of data in the second half that shows you that it's almost now unstoppable, then this vision, which was Sir Arthur C. Clarke's and Stanley Kubrick's vision of a human base in a crater called Clavius on the southern hemisphere of the moon, facing the Earth. Every full moon night you can look up, and with an even small pair of binoculars or telescope, you can see Clavius. And from there, the moon, or rather the Earth, is just hovering over the horizon. Why did Arthur, of all things, put in both the novel and with Stanley in the film in 2001, this incredibly predictive classic film, as you're going to see? Why did he put this base at Clavius in the southern hemisphere of the moon? Well, here's a picture. This is not a NASA picture. This is not an official shot. This is done by a gentleman named Damien Peach, who is a UK countryman of yours, lives somewhere down south of it, I believe. He goes to the Bahamas, to Barbados, to clear air, and he photographs the planets and the moon with stunning, stunning resolution and clarity with a telescope which is no bigger than a 14-inch mirror. And he does this routinely, and he posts his images, he and many, many other high-end amateurs all around the world, and they are now looking, as I report in Dark Mission, in the revised edition, they are looking at the moon and they are photographing ruins on the moon. These are actual artificial structures, ancient structures, all around Clavius. Just look at the geometry. The key to finding ruins all over the solar system, as I'm going to show you in part 2, is the geometry that radiates into space through the optical imagery, announces its presence to the sky, because nature does not do this incredible honeycomb-like geometry for mile after mile. These look like ancient abandoned apartment complexes sitting on the hills outside San Francisco, and they're about the same scale. The details of this are, of course, reported in Dark Mission, including actual photographs, other photographs taken by Peach and some of these other amateurs. I used the old Cronkite rule of thumb. Don't take one source, don't take two sources, get 3 independent sources. So I picked 3 independent amateur astronomers who I'm not even sure they know each other. And I printed their independent, separate imagery of ruins on the moon. These ruins are in the northern hemisphere that can be photographed from Earth. And now, of course, more and more amateurs are able to do this all over the globe. And it's only a matter of time until somewhere, somehow, the mainstream press pick up on this and they say, oh my gosh. And they fund even bigger telescopes to do it for the big guys, the real guys, the network guys. The clock is ticking. Well, as part of this secret agenda that I believe Obama is quietly, with that legislation, put on track, there are also plans to go to Mars. Now, Mars is interesting because, of course, a certain guy wrote a book about Mars, and there's all kinds of ruins on Mars. Would you like to see something you have never seen anywhere else before that is unmistakably an actual ruin on Mars? Here it is. This is a 2,000-foot long ship, the size of a big super tanker here on Earth. Scale up just a little bit. Notice this weird slide mark. This thing, in the great catastrophe, the flood on Mars, that sloshed the oceans, all of this is in Dark Mission, so you can read about the details. This is not a mesa. This is not a butte. This is not a mountain, because mountains don't slide. They don't slide for 10,000 feet across the surface before coming ass end first, because that's where the engines are, and that's the heaviest part. The consistency of this, when I showed Nuri years ago this photograph, he jumped out of his chair. This is a comparison of some of the details on a Mars Surveyor image with the famed QE2. You can actually see decking, you can see rounded hull plating, you can see fantail, you can see the bow broken off. It turns out, I didn't know this, that when ships founder at sea and they sink, in many, many, many cases, the bow, because that's a weak point, breaks off and lies on the sea floor, excuse me, right next to the ship. That's what we see here. The bow broke off in the enormous cataclysm that befell Mars and sloshed the oceans. And whatever was on here, whoever was on here, obviously did not make it. But the ship survived. Now, we've tried to get NASA, excuse me, to give us much higher resolution imagery from Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. I've tried, certain people like Keith Laney have tried. NASA will not even respond to our emails. They refuse to take a high-res image, which would show things on the order of this water bottle, as opposed to the smallest things, which are on the order of the size of this auditorium, on this ship. Gosh, I wonder why. Which brings us, of course, back to the uncertain future. How do we make that future not uncertain? How do we create certainty out of uncertainty? How do we do again what John Kennedy was able to do at Rice University when he said and proclaimed for all the world to hear, in a different era, a different time, and a different people, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept and we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. In that vein, again, a different era, a different time, a different people, this president, a few months ago, enunciated that he wants to send astronauts to an asteroid. Why perchance an asteroid? Well, you're going to find out. These are the asteroids. Bits of rock and dust and chunks and bergy bits and all that floating around between the orbit of Mars and Jupiter. There are huge debates as to whether asteroids are planets that don't get together, or in fact planets that in fact were blown apart. A planet that exploded. The late Tom Van Flandern, my friend and colleague, was of the mind that the planet 5, the missing planet in the solar system, was the origin of this trail of rubble and rocks and debris that we call the asteroid belt. The evidence is really overwhelming that that model, which we made some contributions to in terms of how Mars fits into the scenario, because Mars, it turns out, was probably a moon of that exploded planet. If you want to understand some of the dynamics of the politics behind this, read the work of Dr. Joseph Farrell. I commend strongly his whole series on a cosmic interplanetary war, because whatever blew this sucker up appeared to be people doing really dumb and stupid things with toys they should never have been allowed to play with. They blew it up themselves, if we are right. Why does Obama want to send the Orion spacecraft with a service module and gear and all kinds of equipment that would allow astronauts to survive for several months in deep interplanetary space? Why does he want to rendezvous with and land on an asteroid? Because it turns out the asteroids are probably the key to blowing the doors off the cover-up at NASA for the last 30 plus years, and in fact, ushering in real physical disclosure, which is, as I'm talking tonight here in Leeds, ongoing out in space about 2.5 times as far away as we orbit from the sun. On an unmanned mission, the Dawn mission, with an ion-powered spacecraft that is visiting 2 of the main belt asteroids. First, for a year, orbiting Vesta, which is the second most massive asteroid known, almost a mini planet, a little world, as the NASA guys who've now seen the photographs are calling her. And then Ceres, which is the largest asteroid, which is technically not an asteroid anymore according to the IAU, but a dwarf planet. This one is about 330 miles across. This one is something like 500 miles across. And it is to these objects, first this one now, and then in a few years with the ion-powered spacecraft to go into orbit around Ceres in 2015, 2016, just about the time that the heavy lift vehicle, the Orion spacecraft, and a new manned human mission to asteroids comes into fruition, will all arrive synchronously together in the politics of NASA. So what do we see at these asteroids? This, by the way, is a comparison of size. Here's the moon, here's the Earth, 8,000 miles, 2,000 miles, 330 miles, 500 miles. This is their relative size. Everybody thinks that NASA's visiting a rock. Oh, no. Whatever Vesta is, it is not a rock. This is a schematic artist conception of the spacecraft. 65-foot-long solar panels take in sunlight, convert to electricity, and propel this spacecraft through space with something that back in Gene's day, back in the first season of Star Trek, remember when Scotty was oogling and eyeing about ion propulsion? Like it was something, I mean, come on, the warp drive was much cooler than ion propulsion even then. But for a mainstream audience, it sounded really cool, so of course scriptwriters said, oh, ion propulsion. Now this mission, if it was not for ion propulsion, would not exist, because they were able to, by remote control, put this little Dawn spacecraft, because it's the panels that are this big, the actual spacecraft is about the size of a car, into orbit around Vesta, and it's been there now for several weeks, since January 16th. Oh yes, January 16th. What date is that? That's the date that Apollo 11 was launched with Neil and Buzz and Mike Collins aboard in 1969 for a first human mission to the moon, to land and return. NASA loves anniversary dates, particularly symbolic and ritual dates. This is a schematic showing the spacecraft, showing the various instrumentation, the cameras and the other gadgets and the star trackers and the antenna and the solar panels. Again, the panels provide the electricity to fuel, to power the engine, which actually spurts out a beam of high velocity ions, creates thrust. This is the multi-year mission orbit showing as it leaves Earth and winds around the solar system, rendezvous with Mars, got a gravity assist to toss it further out. Because the asteroids aren't all in the same plane as the planets, changing planes in orbit is very expensive in terms of fuel and velocity. So they were able to use Mars as a kind of a slingshot effect to kick Dawn into a higher inclination orbit, so ultimately it could rendezvous with Vesta on the 16th a few weeks ago. This is now the first picture that they beamed back. Hidden behind this little occulting disk, a few pixels across, because you're millions of miles away, is Vesta out there in the dark with the navigation camera taking star sights, which is how they actually do the last tweaks on the orbit and hone in on their target. Because even though these objects have been around for hundreds of years in terms of astronomical knowledge, their orbits are not that well defined, certainly to get a spacecraft to and from. So they use actual, what they call optical navigation, to navigate the last few million miles. This is now a series of approach shots. Vesta is not a ball. It's not spherical. In fact, as you're going to see, it has the most remarkable shape, but it's a symmetrical shape. And the shape alone is telling us something pretty amazing. Closer shot now, taken a few weeks ago as it approached. This is a comparison between the Dawn image of Vesta as it closed in and the best Hubble telescope picture from, I think it was 1997 when they took this. This is what we saw then, this is what we saw a few weeks ago, and this, of course, is what we saw even sooner, or more recently. Now you can begin to see that there is something unusual. There is a huge mountain, protuberance, thing in the southern hemisphere lying right across the South Pole. Vesta rotates like this. You're looking at it kind of up at an angle. The North Pole is on the other side. It's like a flattened hamburger bun. And it spins like this every 5 hours and 20 minutes. Very rapidly, much more rapidly than the Earth, for instance. But it's got this funny thing at the pole. And that funny thing, this, by the way, is now a computer model from the Hubble data showing the axis and showing the rotation orientation. And this funny mountain is right here, very close to the axis of the South Pole. The mainstream guys think this was a huge impact and a central peak, which occurs on the moon and other bodies in the solar system because of what are called impact dynamics. I don't think that's the explanation of this thing at all. At all. Either its shape, the placement, or some of the things you're about to see. Because as you get closer, this is now a closer shot, here's that weird mountain, and you can begin to see some detail. Yes, there are some craters, but there are also these funny lines. And the closer you get, or the more you basically sharpen the image, let me go back and forth, rock this a bit. This is the NASA view. This is what we did by enhancing it just a tad. You can begin to see now patterns. And then, if you do this, you see some astonishing geometric patterns, particularly in this one quadrant, and you see what seemed to be mile after mile after mile of large-scale honeycombing. Remember, this little world, 300 miles across, the size of Connecticut, if you don't invoke really exotic models like aluminum-26, radioactive isotope, decaying furiously, giving heat so that you'll have all kinds of internal geological activity, but geology doesn't create regular honeycomb-type patterns. However, if the southern hemisphere had been exposed to a blast of the exploding planet, and the shrapnel, the sandblasting, the sheer debris, trillions and trillions of tons of fine material blowing past this southern hemisphere at kilometers per second, scouring off miles and miles of the material on the surface, leaving exposed an understructure of some kind that literally was built on top of whatever the natural body was. This kind of regular geometry would kind of be what you should see. That's a model which we can test. So as they got closer, I'm looking now, here's that big, huge thing sticking up. You can see the size of it compared to the shadow. These are craters, impact craters, and the background lineations. Getting closer, you can now see that there's much more detail visible. We rotate, when you're looking for this kind of geometry, it's always important if you have a computer and you take these images in from NASA, you download them, that you basically rotate the image, because the eye-brain combination sees this kind of geometry best if it's straight up and down or left and right. At an angle, it's not easy to see. So either tilt your head or tilt the picture in your computer so you see from all different directions, 360 degrees landscape, so you can see incipient geometry, and the real stuff will pop out. So by rotating this around, look now at this, what we call orthogonal patterns, left and right and up and down, boxes, lines, right angles, nested geometry, over and over and over and over again. And the scale of this is humongous. That's telling us some pretty amazing things, either in the natural model or in the artificial model. And if you looked at the press conference that NASA held the other day, all the scientists who seemed to me to be kind of talking in code kept saying things like, this is unbelievable. This is totally unexpected. We haven't seen this before. We didn't think this was good. In other words, they're saying all the things you'd say if, in fact, it's what I think it is. You're going to see more details in a moment. But they're doing it very carefully because it's not yet time to talk about what's really there. They are going to want to take pictures from as low and as close as possible. And in this next year, the current orbit is about 1,700 miles above the surface. Remember, the object is 300 miles across. You're 1,700 miles away, which is half the width of the United States, give or take. This image, by the way, was taken from about 6,000 miles away, I think. The final mapping orbit is going to be 100 miles, which means the pictures are going to be 100 times bigger. I'm sorry, this was 10,000 miles. 100 times bigger. Think of this object from here to here, and then extend it that away 50 times, and that away 50 times, and that's the level of detail you're going to see on the final shots. And you can bet your dollars to Navy beans that if they see stuff that's really got to have better resolution, remember, this is a little airless world. There's no atmosphere, no friction, which means you can bring this sucker, Dawn, with the ion engine right down like 10 miles, 5 miles, once you get the gravity field mapped so that you don't wind up, as it rotates, you wind up hitting a mountain or whatever they're called. That is going to be the kind of safety precaution, not to get too close because you don't want to end the mission catastrophically. But if they see what we now believe they're going to see and are already seeing, that's why at the press conference they kept saying, well, we really can't say anything because we need better pictures. We need higher resolution pictures. Well, they damn well do, because what they're seeing is something they've never expected. Remember, our model is that most of the system is honest. Most of NASA does not know what is out there because they've been kept from knowing. The number of people that actually have looked at real ruins and know what they're seeing is a tiny handful of people in an organization of 20,000 folks, give or take, that work for NASA and all the contractors that work for Lockheed and Boeing and the other big aerospace companies. You can keep this data really, really, really tightly controlled because remember, there's no people out there able to get on their cell phones and say, oh my God, Charlie, look at this. It's a robot. It tells you exactly what, you can tell it what to do and tell it who not to talk to. So that unless you give the pictures out to everybody, and that's what makes this really interesting because for the first time in all the time that I've been looking at NASA data, this kind of regular, unvarnished, raw imagery showing geometry, redundant rectilinear geometry on the surface of a world like this is being shown to everybody simultaneously. There's no airbrushing, they're not censoring, they're not keeping it in a drawer, they're just not talking about it yet. And we live in a culture, and I use that term very loosely, covering the entire planet, we live in a culture where people don't know how to think for themselves. A lot of people look at this and they will not see what I'm describing. Not only are they conceptually unable to think about it as being real, but physiologically, there was a Boeing study many years ago that Barra turned me on to because he worked in the CAD program designing airplanes. And what they do when they hired various people at Boeing is they would give them tests. Who can see three-dimensional stringers and rebar and airplane parts without a computer so that they know how to actually build an airplane without putting it together wrong? It's like an erector set. Turned out from their studies that about a third of the population can see this type of geometry without any training at all. You just look at it, bingo, and you can see it. About a third can be trained, can be taught to see this geometry. And a third can't. I was going to use another term, but I'll be kind. I won't, because it's not their fault. They just can't see it. Now you add to that the physiological and psychological idea that this is impossible, that there can be nothing there like I've been talking about for decades, and that third is actually more like half. So half the population start right away with not only not being able to see it, but they don't want to see it. They can't see it. Mentally, they're unprepared to see it. They don't want it to be there. It will disturb their world too much, and they just want it to go away. But that leaves the other half that either can see it or will be willing to see it, provided someone shows them how. Moving on. This is now closer. Look at this. I mean, you do not get this kind of box-like formation in natural geology anywhere on Earth or in the solar system. The physics of how you make this stuff is not there. It simply is not there. And you can't wave your arm and say, oh, it's another planet, then anything goes. No, it doesn't. If you're taking that position, you have to show a process for how to get from here to there. You have to show an actual physics for how that kind of wondrous geometry arises naturally. And there is no such model anywhere in any university or textbook or tome or research paper or study anywhere on Earth, certainly on a scale of 300 plus miles. Now remember, if I'm right, we're looking at the base of an object which has all kinds of structural I-beams and rebar and supports, and the surface was blasted away, revealing the huge mega-sized guts that keep this as an orbiting station. Vesta has been, in this model, modified by a super civilization that Farrell and I and others have called a Type 2 civilization, which comes from the work of a brilliant Russian named Kardashev, borrowed loosely by Michio Kaku on Art Bell many, many years ago, and talked about as Kaku's idea. He actually borrowed it from Kardashev, and Kardashev listed 3 levels of civilization that he expected, this back in the 60s, that we might encounter someday, or at least encounter their works, back when even mainstream guys were kind of optimistic. One was Type 1. We're about a Type 0.7. Type 1 is defined as a civilization which controls the energies of its entire planet. A Type 2 is a civilization that controls the energies of its entire star, meaning it can use those energies to remake its entire solar system. And that, in our model, in a nutshell, is what we think we've been seeing over the last several decades. evidence from all NASA's manned and unmanned missions, going from the moon to Mars, to the satellites of Jupiter, out to the rings of Saturn, and even at Neptune, we see evidence of artificial tinkering and restructuring by a super Type 2 civilization that did something absolutely horrible to itself and convulsed itself in a monstrous civil war, unless it was invaded, and I frankly think it may have been a civil war. Joseph Arrow and I have this argument all the time. And all we're now left with is the ruins of our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers in something incredibly stupid they did one day, like when Oppenheimer was testing the atomic bomb in the American Southwest millions of years later, and the physicists were arguing with each other, well, is it going to ignite the atmosphere and burn us all to death, or is it not? And they decided, come on, let's take a chance. And that's what they did. They did not know. They did not have the physics and the calculations to know. They simply bet that it wouldn't happen. And it didn't. Unless it did, and we're all dead, and we're living this very bizarre dream, which sometimes watching CNN, watching what's going on in the White House and Washington these days, I really wonder, are we alive, or is this, Robin talks about, Saturday Night Live all the time. We are living a Saturday Night Live nightmare. And the only thing that's going to change it, I believe, is something like this that hits everybody between the eyes, because it cannot be ignored and denied anymore. If I'm right, you're going to see in a couple minutes now, that clock is ticking. Even now in Washington, lights are burning and people are saying, holy cow, because most of the honest folks are as stunned as some of you are going to be as you see the next set of pictures with what's there, and which is not being covered up, because you've got to bring the mainstream, the honest people, into the enclave, into the conversation before we can politically take the next step. This type of geometry on this scale says, A, we're ants. B, we know nothing. C, they were destroyed. And D, whoever did it might still be out there. And can you imagine how they are feeling at the Pentagon tonight? Particularly with Elanine on the way. Oh, I mentioned Elanine. Something is coming, as you will see. So we go closer. You see more and more of this rectilinearity. Now, there are several versions of this data. This is a photograph that was taken, let me go here, all right? That was taken a few hours later. Remember, this thing rotates every 5 hours, 20 minutes. And the sunlight changes constantly so that you can see different lighting patterns, and the geometry shows up. Lower incidence lighting, you get nice shadows, and you see these rectilinear patterns, grid-like patterns. Then they took an infrared shot, which was color-coded. So we're looking at color filter data, possibly indicative of chemistry, of material differences. This is the infrared on the right, this is the black and white on the left, and you can see that that mountain, whatever that thing is, has a different color, bluish, and then there's this very weird splotch. Again, you're looking almost straight up at the South Pole, and the asteroid or object or mini planet rotates this way 300 miles from here to here. Now we go closer. One of the guys at unmannedspaceflight.com, whose name is Euromike, actually he has another name and I forget what it is, but his code name is Euromike. What he did was he superimposed, he melded together in the computer the black and white shot with the infrared color shot. So you have high-res black and white underneath the composition differences, the materials of the color. And this is what you see. Now, human eye combinations see differences in geometry better in color than black and white. We can go closer, and you see this amazing rectilinear pattern over and over again, which example, particularly right in here. Look at all this delicate right angle stuff. This, I now believe, is a monstrous ruin of what used to be a pyramidal structure. I've had some guys on Facebook actually claiming they recognize that it looks vaguely Incan or Aztec to them. That could or could not be true because there's cultural, lineage descendants that's possible. There's only certain ways to make a structure, and you replicate that way again and again and again. Or there's a cultural frame, a religious frame, a way of looking at the universe that makes a certain structure. The point is, it was Sagan who set the tone and tone of this conversation. He said, this was back in Cosmos, back in 71, intelligent life on Earth first manifests itself in the geometric regularity of its constructions. If you have regular geometry, you have intelligence. Nature on this scale does not, has never, and cannot, given the physics that we think we know. Now you can say, okay, there's another physics. Well, but now what you've done is you've violated the rules of the game. Because what NASA does, what the geologists do at NASA when they're looking at a new planet for the first time, they take all the laws of physics that they've learned here on Earth and they apply them to this new world. Why is it only honest to do it in terms of natural processes, but it's dishonest to do it in terms of us? We're part of the universe. We're part of the fabric of the environment, of nature, of reality, 3D reality. Why would we draw the line between natural things and artificial things? Well, it's an artificial line. It's a political fabrication. We're getting to the end of part one here, so hang in there for another 2 minutes. How you look at this is through these kinds of eyes. This is something, all right? I'm not going to tell you what it is. How many can see what it is, and how many think that it might just be a nice bunch of holes punctured by meteorites on some other world? I'll call your attention to this stuff here, these guys here. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sharpen the image, because this, in fact, is a classic artificial structure in New Mexico called Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico, just a few miles from where Robin and I live. And the holes are kivas. They're ceremonial centers. The living apartments are over here. Let me rock back. You can still see the geometry, but unless you're trained, you understand what you'd be looking for if you had better imagery, you might miss it. But in fact, it's artificial, and now, of course, we can go to color. We add the color, and bingo, you see vegetation, you see roads, you see... In other words, geometry is the indicator of intelligent life anywhere in the universe, because intelligence that we know, by the rules of the game that we can extrapolate, produces regular geometry, and nature does not. Particularly, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes filled with ticky-tacky. Remember that one? Back to here. You see that kind of regular geometry. It's fuzzy. It's desperately fuzzy. You yearn for a better picture. Well, here's another example. This is a picture of something. I'll give you a hint. It's in a desert here on Earth. We get better data. Bingo. Now you can see its walls, its ruined walls, it's submerged under sand wall. This is in Egypt, the deserts of Egypt. This is what it looks like at low res, but you can still see that kind of rectilinear geometry. That is your clue. Be suspicious. Demand better data. And lo and behold, when you get it, many things can happen. Well, the Vesta mission is going to wind down, spiral down over the next several weeks in this kind of curve to get into these three mapping positions, 1,700 miles, 500 miles, and about 100 miles. These are the final orbits that it will position itself in, taking different data at different distances. This is a composite of images taken as they drifted in toward orbit. You can see how the resolution got better and better. You're coming up under the South Pole, so this thing, pyramid, mountain, whatever, and this whole exposed southern hemisphere is not only visible, but it now becomes more and more of a crescent as they went around behind the planet and came back down in this polar orbit a few days ago at around 3,000 miles and gave us this amazing image. Look at the grooves, which are symmetrical with the rotation axis. What could do that? This is now an enhanced version. Then what we do is we flip it, because remember, looking at geometry, you want to look at different angles in different directions because your eye will see the geometry up and down and left and right a lot easier than any other configuration. Now we're taking a close-up of this region, and we're going to zoom in. Look at all that regular geometry. Now, initially when you look at it, it's confusing. You have to actually live with this stuff for hours. Your eye has to get used to patterns. It has to see the shape of random craters like this one here from this very regular this is layered, by the way. It's not a flat surface. It's multiple layers. Eroded by time, eroded by micrometeorites, eroded by abrasion. Look at the stunning regular patterns. These are not holes punched by meteors hitting it from outside. This is an intrinsic, I could lay this side by side, as I will in a minute, with city patterns here on Earth, and you cannot, unless you know what you're looking at, tell the difference. Here's another section I'm going to show you. This is the final close-up of that. Look at and again, it's fuzzy and soft because it's been abraded and eroded. But a trained eye knows instantly that this kind of pattern, look at the right angles here. Look at right angles here. Who makes rectangular craters with little rectangles and lattice beams and 3D with shadows? Even this huge crater was an impact into an artificial lattice-like surface. All right, this is one of my favorites. Here's the area we're going to look at. Notice these guys right here. They're all in a row. They're rectangular. They're eroded. There's another area here which has amazing, there's geometry all over here. This isn't a landscape where you got a building and then flat land and then another building. This is a constructed surface. It reminds me, if anybody is a fan of Isaac Asimov and his Foundation series, he talks about Trantor, the planet at the center of the galaxy that rules the galactic empire. He wrote this in the 50s. We're looking at replications of Trantor. What was Isaac trying to tell us? We're almost at the end of part one. Here's closer. Look at the geometry here. Look at these. They're all arrayed in a line, and you've got an impact. Here's an impact. See, it's round. It's actually, here's another impact. These aren't impacts. These are squares arrayed in a line parallel to this line of stuff. And this is, again, Carl's maxim. Look for the geometry, and you will be rewarded with this comparison. This is on Vesta. This is Anasazi ruins, not far from where Robin and I live. And look at how erosion of rectangular walls is identical morphologically between something which is a few hundred feet across here and something here which is who were these people? And are they potentially the source of the rumors and mythologies and descriptions in the Bible of giants in those days? That's a whole other discussion. This now is the various visions of Vesta in terms of the approach imagery, showing where some of these features are located. Here's now a final shot showing this region. We've rotated it around again. It is honeycombed. The surface is honeycombed, and the closer you get, the more geometry you can see, the more regular lattice-type geometry. I mean, look at the lattice work over here. Natural surfaces do not look like this. You can see it's also almost fractal. You know how you have large-scale stuff, and then it gets smaller scale and smaller scale and smaller scale, like it replicates down and down and down? We can speculate till the cows come home as to what we're looking at, but until we actually land, we're not going to know. And maybe we'll know a lot more in terms of artificial models. Here, look at these right angles. Here's another one. Here's a whole bunch of wonderful right angles. Box-like forms. Nature does not create these. Look at this is walls. You have parallel walls, which are the same width that go on for thousands of feet. And moving down, you can see more structural detail in here. Again, the more you linger with these images on the computer, the more and easier it becomes to see the patterns over and over again. There are very few discrete forms that show up on this bashed and battered world. We're going to rotate it around now and show you one last thing right here. All right? This one. What in the world is this? We rotate it around. Here's more grid-like patterns next to it. Here it is wide angle. We flip it. What in the world? It's got some kind of 3D multi-leaved shape. And then when we rotate it 180 degrees and zoom in, it seems like it has petals that are sitting over a circular area. Craters don't make this morphology. We're going to get photographs 100 times better in the matter of a few months. You can see, again, more geometry at the base with support structure. This is very eerily reminiscent of this. And the Dawn mission will tell us a lot more. These are the guys that are running the Dawn mission. This is the principal investigator. Here's the head of the camera. This guy's from UCLA Berkeley. This guy's from Germany. This is what I would want you to do. Write down during the pause, our little intermission here, which is now, for about 10 minutes, write down this address. Send these guys a note. Demand that this level of honest imagery, of stunning stuff that should not be there, continue, and that ultimately they analyze and announce what this really is in a public forum. And you'll see some amazing things happen in the next few weeks, if in fact enough of us, like with the Enterprise, all get together and demand something from our governments, because UK is involved as much as the United States. It's part of ESA, which is part of the project. See you shortly in part 2. I'm hoping these mics are on. If they're not, this is going to be a very wasted second half, which is going to be about exactly the same length as the first half, because I tried to divide this and we actually hit our marks because we started late. So with that good news, let me find my laser pointer. Okay, with that as prelude, what I see happening politically is that as the Vesta information proceeds, as NASA continues to give us better and better and clear imagery. I mean, they're even publishing TIFF images of this data. They've never done that before this early. A TIFF image, for those who aren't computer geeks, is an uncompressed image where what you see on the image is basically what's there. It's not JPEG, it's not got little jaggies, it's not got all kinds of what we call compression artifacts. A TIFF is the best public image version of data from NASA that you can get. They're publishing TIFFs of these images. As I say up there, or I said, actually I'll pop it back up, if they continue doing what they're doing, which is showing us what's really there, there will come a point, and it's going to be probably weeks away, maybe a little longer, maybe a month or two, but it's in the foreseeable horizon now, where the Vesta data is so damn good that a bunch of honest mainstream guys in public are going to begin thinking and talking and speaking about the unthinkable. Otherwise, none of this is going to work. And at some point, a producer at CNN... Really? Okay, well... Okay. At some point, that conversation is going to leak into ABC, CBS, NBC, and it's going to hit everyone in a mainstream network news story, which, as my friend Kevin Sanders used to say, is quickly then picked up by all the other guys and becomes the story of the day. I mean, you've seen this over and over and over again with the Casey Anthony trial, with the debt ceiling crisis, with, Representative Weiner, whatever is Weiner. All those stories, they act like a herd, like a flock. And all it takes is one of them to land on a story. And ancient ruins on an asteroid, totally unexpected by any of the honest mainstream guys, is going to become a huge story, provided NASA continues to show us this honest imagery. And they don't freak out and something mysteriously suddenly happens to the spacecraft or whatever. Now, I'm betting that what we're seeing is not by accident. It's part of the, what they call in the intelligence community, soak time. The ability to basically move the conversation in the right direction, thank you, by showing data that is at some point irrefutable. So I would project politically that in the next few weeks or months, let's give it a couple of months, as this spacecraft continues to circle and spiral closer and closer, and the photos get better and better and better. Now, I believe that NASA is being mandated politically by some outside agency to finally tell us the truth. I don't think this is coming from inside NASA. Why don't I think that? Because they're doing everything they can not to give us live imagery. They have now thousands of images, this or better, in the bank. They've given us one image per week. And they're talking now in the mission when they get into orbit of giving us in the next week or two, starting maybe the 11th of August, one image per day. But one image per day is like 1/1000th of the number of images they're going to be taking. Because the constraint to taking imagery has been you can't fire the engine and change the orbit and get in the right orbit and take pictures simultaneously. If you remember, the cameras are up on top, the engine is on the bottom, so if it's pointed in the right direction, the cameras are pointed in the wrong direction, et cetera, et cetera. So they've got to be in a stable orbit with the spacecraft flipped upside down, the cameras looking down to take the pictures. There's no reason why we should get one picture per day. And there is a mounting criticism, again, in the mainstream community. Hey guys, you know, the rover guys at Mars are giving us live pictures, dozens per day. Why are you being so stingy? And you can all help. If you write this address and you demand more imagery, if you demand they do like the MER project, the Mars Exploration Rover project, or the Cassini mission to Saturn, where Carolyn Porco, who is a really big Star Trek fan and gets it, gave us live images, thousands upon thousands of images live, which allow talented amateurs, like at unmannedspaceflight.com, to massage them and put them in computers and tweak them and enhance them and companion them and composite them and put them into mosaics and all that, which is free labor to present what NASA's doing to the world for nothing. And if that can be encouraged by a bunch of people that are frankly acting like old fogies, like 30 years ago, where you had to physically go to a kiosk at some museum to see a handful of black and white pictures that they tacked up on the board, when now we have the internet and day or night 24/7, you can see anything going on anywhere on the planet. It's not appropriate to the 21st century, particularly given what's in these images. So that's the first thing you can do, is to make more data available. Demand of them more data availability, because the more data that's out there, the more likelihood that some producer, some reporter, some guy working for the New York Times is going to see stuff and go, holy cow, is that what I think it is? Like, I just had a guy come up to me and he said that this very strange object, let me back up, okay, back up. Hang on. This object looks to him like the Opera House in Australia, the Sydney Opera House, with the clamshell architecture. It's not a two-dimensional structure. In fact, we now have from the press conference a rotation movie that I did not have time to put into this because literally the news is breaking so fast, and Rob and I were on an airplane all night, and I obviously wouldn't have had time, given all the technical problems and getting this again prepared for you now, to show it here, but there's several now new angles of this at different sun angles and different viewing angles, and there's no question these are huge clamshells arching over this thing in 3 dimensions. That can't happen in nature, particularly on this scale. This thing is miles across. So what is it? As I said a moment ago, it looks like that. These are the guys that can tell us if we keep the system honest. This guy in particular can tell us, Chris Russell. They're at that address. Send them email. Bombard them. Inundate them with email. All my Facebook people, 20,000 people on my fan page alone, if every one of you sent an email, you would be astonished at what could happen. They would be terrified, absolutely terrified that people are watching and are going to hold them accountable, if not here, then in some other country. Because we're not the only population in the West. There's China, there's Russia, there's the lowlands, the highlands, there's Australia. There's a globe of people all connected in the new sphere, Teilhard Chardin's famous phrase. Electronically, who can now peer over their shoulders, and what they're trying to do is drag their feet, those that know what's going on, because they don't want this to break, and it's got to break, and someone, I believe, is mandating that it break, and I think this is the guy. Because what was discussed around the State of the Union a few months ago was the idea of a Sputnik moment. The moment in the West, 40 plus years ago, when everything changed. And we suddenly were galvanized, particularly in the United States, because of competition from the Soviet Union to do what we had never done before, and to create the industrial infrastructure and the economics of the 21st century by means of Kennedy's valiant call to rise to the challenge, to undertake an enterprise mission, and to boldly seize the resources, the knowledge base of a solar system for the benefit of all mankind. That did not proceed to fruition because of other forces and agendas. It can now happen. Everything is in place. All it's required is the spark, the fuse being lit. And that fuse can be your emails to those people demanding the truth, such as we now will see in real time what this and a stunning number of other structures on this little place really turn out to be. Now, it's very interesting. The White House, as you know, puts out official press pictures of the president in various motifs and various locations and all that as part of the message of the day. Ronald Reagan started this. Obviously, this administration and others have continued it. And so whenever you see an official photograph of the president doing something, you have to ask yourself, what's he really doing? Why am I seeing this picture? What is it that someone wants me to see? Well, the day of Atlantis' final launch from the Cape, the president put out, through his press office, this picture. The president watching television, flat screen, showing different network coverage of the launch of Atlantis, and they put this flat screen in a specific location. Look at the location. Look where they positioned him. This is the president a few weeks earlier, where he had gone down to see the Endeavour launch, which did not take place. It was actually supposed to take place at 19.47 Greenwich Mean Time in Cape Canaveral, at the same time, the same day as the royal wedding here in Britain. And some very curious things went on around the launch, and it was postponed in ways that made me very, very suspicious, ways that have never happened in the entire history of the space program before. But the president continued, landed in Air Force One, walked with his family under Atlantis, and actually got got a tour of the final spaceship of the shuttle program prior to her final launch and return. And then they put out this photograph showing Atlantis leaving Earth for the last time under this painting, which is very symbolic to me because what you see here is a different era. You see, remember, it was Kennedy who compared space flight to the new ocean. In fact, NASA actually put out a book called The New Ocean, describing Mercury, Gemini, and the beginnings of Apollo, based on his and Ted Sorensen, his brilliant, gifted speechwriters, capture of that phrase, space is the new ocean. Look at what Obama had himself photographed in front of. An ocean with a steam primitive cargo vessel chugging along, like a different era. Like the image is supposed to convey, this represents this part of space flight and something else, to pardon the expression, is dawning. Which brings us to this place. This is an artistic representation of a little moon called Phobos, which orbits Mars in 7 tetrahedral hours, 39 tetrahedral minutes, and some of you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. A moon which has become really exciting because with the Mars Express mission, the ESA mission that you guys are involved in, at least partly as part of the European Union, we've gotten some astonishing images of Phobos over the last few years. Images showing, oh my, what do we, oh, more regular geometry. Except this appears, this object is only about 15 miles across. This geometry is visible in this stark form only on one side. On the other side, it seems to be covered up. Why is this side different than the other side? Because this side is the front. Phobos goes around Mars and orbits Mars in the same period of time as it takes to spin on its own axis because of something called tidal lock. It's in a tidal lock configuration. So like our own moon, it orbits around and keeps one side always facing Mars every 7 hours and 39 minutes. That's the side that I believe is scoured off by micrometeorite abrasion. It basically, this object has no gravity. It's like a billionth of the Earth or something. So any particle that hits, ping, stuff flies off into space and doesn't stick and doesn't lie in the valleys and the bottoms of whatever and mantle and cover and conceal what's underneath. Look at this astonishing rectilinear geometry. This is now a close-up. You can actually see that there are decks here. There's weird, long, lineal, this looks like a cable maybe. The scale of this is all very human. It's very terrestrial scaled. And if you do the comparison, this is a Mercator projection map of the weird lines, grooves, pattern. This is a nighttime satellite image taken from ISIS of the streetlights of Los Angeles. Geometry, geometry, geometry. This is the orthogonal geometry I keep talking about. Now notice that it varies depending upon how the architects had to change, but you have parallelisms. Again, it isn't that it's rigidly rectilinear, it's that it's quasi-rectilinear and has a coherent pattern, meaning a logical pattern. This geometry is incredibly analogous to this geometry, except of course this is on a little moon orbiting Mars, you know, almost, what is it, 200 million miles away from the sun, 100 million and a half, and this, of course, is in the Los Angeles basin. But Carl's dictum prevails. Intelligent life on Earth first manifests itself in the geometric regularity of its constructions. Well, lo and behold, look who is trying in this image to get President Barack Obama really interested in Phobos. Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon, flew with him to Cape Canaveral, where the president gave a speech in April of 2010, enunciating the new vision, where he talked about human American astronauts visiting an asteroid. Well, in the mainstream eyes, this object qualifies as a captured asteroid. At least that's been the model up till now. However, Buzz, during the anniversary ceremonies around the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, a couple of years ago, and recently has been talking about something else on Phobos, which is tantalizingly intriguing because of what it tells me that Buzz really knows that he can't talk about yet, but its time and day is coming, and it is this. There is a monolith on Phobos. This is an artist rendition done by Efron Palermo, one of my colleagues. We worked many years ago on the seeps, the groundwater coming out of Mars in all kinds of places, particularly in two bilobe patterns indicative of Mars having two tidal oceans back when it was a moon circling Planet 5 before the damn thing blew up. This is an actual Mars surveyor shot showing the amazing geometry of a tall, this is almost as tall as the Washington Monument in D.C., 500 feet. It's obviously very, very broad at the top, and it appears to be, this is a very accurate reconstruction, which if I had the time I would have shown you all the geometry of the shadowing and the 3D CAD modeling and all that. This thing does not belong on Phobos, which should be a little battered rock smashed by meteor bombardment over billions and billions and billions of years. That's the standard model. Except that's not what's going on here. I think this is the place that Buzz would like to land, because suppose this is a new addition to an ancient Phobos. Suppose this was created by a previous high-tech civilization on Earth in one of the earlier epochs of the rise and fall of civilization we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And this, in fact, is the elevator, where you land on top, go in a door, go down inside to experience whatever wonders this Type 2 civilization have left for its great, 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 great descendants. And Aldrin knows this is true. Well, obviously, if you're a public speaker and you use a term like monolith, and you're Buzz Aldrin, and you have the synoptic vision of having actually walked on the surface of another celestial body, i.e. the moon, you don't use the word monolith in an era of Arthur and Stanley and 2001 by accident. This is another monolith, which existed in Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick's vision of a seminal film that was supposed to define our universe, our world, our reality from 2000 on. Instead, something else horrific and tragic and awful happened, and it has taken center stage, and it has defined the last decade like none other. What was supposed to be a positive, elevated fork in the road for human evolution in their vision became a nightmare, where 2001 stands for one thing and one thing only. It stands for 9/11 and 3,000 people who lost their lives in places like New York, the Pentagon, and Pennsylvania, with lots and lots of copycats ever since. A decade of horror, the likes of which this planet, even in World War II, did not know. Because in World War II, you had fronts, you had boundaries, you had rules. We've now been, for the last 10 years, subjected to conflict which seems to have no rules, which puts all of us at risk, or thinking we're at risk. So we have behaved like lemmings, like sheep, like terrified kids hiding under the bed, thinking, oh, it's going to happen to us. A mechanism of total psychological control, which at a crucial time in the physics, as I will lay out in a couple of minutes, took control of our mindset, our consciousness, our hopes and our dreams, dashed them in pieces, and left us with nothing to hang on to in the way of hope and change and a real future for 6.5 billion people on this planet, except endless privation, endless constrictors, endless lines of magnetometers extending from airplanes to boats and trains and even someday automobiles, where no place will be considered safe because of terrorists. It's a perfect mind, and I can't say the rest of the word on television. The counterpoint to that tragedy was my friend Arthur, who envisioned that the game changer, the thing that would transform humanity from one of want and privation and scarcity and fear, was something that would be found as nearby as the moon itself, the monolith. Something left by someone who cared enough to leave the very best. And in Arthur's vision, which was really the penultimate fruition of his vision from his first novels through the films to his last films and his last writings, he's had one overarching message, which I've been thinking about very much for the last several weeks as I've been getting ready to do this, and I realized that Arthur's entire life was a message about what is coming of this time and what can happen, which can change negativity into something so incredibly transformative and positive that it is, in fact, what is driving the stunning and startling pushback, the fear-mongering going on all over the world, particularly in the internet, about something way out there in the dark called Elanine, which I'll get to momentarily. But if we were to extend Arthur's vision past the moon, the first place, of course, would be Mars. And when I got into the Mars work decades ago, I wrote a whole book, The Monuments of Mars, which turns out to be a tour de force of Arthur's vision, because Cydonia, the mathematics, the geometry, the implied storyline behind the face, and the idea of some kind of intervention into this nursery that led to us, that's all there in reality on Mars, and it has been hushed up and covered up by NASA and the other space agencies because, in the words of Tom Cruise and John Nicholson, not John, Jack, we can't handle the truth. That's their perception. It's time to show them they're wrong. Brookings said we can't handle the truth. It's been the excuse. It's been the facile lie. It's been the peach basket over the really good stuff they've been using for decades to keep us from the good stuff. Well, the more I look into what Arthur was trying in his meta vision to tell us through all these various art forms, the novels, the films, his nonfiction, his fiction, the conversations that he and I had, even the last emails that he sent that Robin actually had read, the more I came to realize that this was Arthur's meta message. Did you know that the original monolith was supposed to be a damn tetrahedron? This is a work of art by MGM, by the art department. This is the Discovery spacecraft. Discovery spacecraft, Discovery space shuttle. That's interesting. And this is the monolith orbiting Jupiter, where, of course, he was supposed to go. But Kubrick couldn't do it in the film because it was too hard to make the rings. No, it wasn't time to really show what Iapetus is really like. And you all know, because I know a number of you have been coming up to me and saying, when is part 7 going to be out? Well, hopefully in the next few weeks I will have peace and quiet, really. At some point, part 7 will be done because we've now got the data to blow the rest of your socks off. You cannot make any wine before it's time. You have got to be able to basically put the pieces together in a way that's coherent and makes sense and is logical and is defensible, and you can't do that until you get the data. Well, NASA finally, a couple, 3 years ago, gave us the last pieces I needed to finish the series. But again, there's also a political timing. If you, to mix our metaphors madly, and to quote from Jesus, if you throw your seed on barren ground, nothing's going to grow. But in this environment now, with images of Vesta showing up that are stunning, even if you don't know what you're looking at, it is now time to show the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. And so the time for Iapetus Part 7, tetrahedrally Part 7, has come. And I promise I will do that hopefully before the end of the year. Maybe a lot before the end of the year. part of it has to do with inspiration. And boy, are we inspired, as you're going to see. There's amazing things happening. Well, why is Arthur's use of a tetrahedron as the monolith, as the teaching tool, as the iconic technology from this super type 2 civilization that reached into the earthly cradle and basically created humankind in his vision 4 million years ago? How is it related to our work? Well, this is the 27 lines on the general cubic surface, the foundations of hyperdimensional physics. This is how it manifests inside a rotating planetary sphere, 2 entwined tetrahedra showing 19.5 north and south energy upwellings. You then look to the solar system and you find all kinds of real-world examples. This is a Voyager shot from back in the 1970s showing that the Great Red Spot, this whirling vorticular maelstrom, which has been going and going and going for 300 years like the Energizer Bunny, and none of the mainstream guys can figure out how a hurricane on Jupiter, which is farther from the sun and gets less energy, can keep going this long. Well, of course, it's not being fueled by the sun. It's being fueled by hyperdimensional release of energy in the core of Jupiter, radiating out, which they finally had to grudgingly admit was confirmed by the Galileo mission a couple of decades ago. But they don't yet know what's really driving, at least they don't yet publicly know. In this whole conversation, you have to continually keep reminding people there's a private conversation and a public conversation. And what they talk about in public is not the same thing they talk about when they're with each other and there's nobody listening. Or as my friend Jerry Glenn used to say, you have to be careful lest in-house language become out-house language. And that shows you what they think of us. So this is the geometry of the inscribed tetrahedron, showing put one tip on the poles, you get latitude points at 19.5, actually 19.47. If you spin it upside down, you get it on the other hemisphere. The Jovian red spot is, in fact, at the vortex tip of one of these circumscribed force vibrating field patterns inside spinning Jupiter that shows up exquisitely as a perennial vortex being fueled by literal hyperspatial energies ducted into our 3D reality from a higher dimensional state space, i.e. another parallel reality, i.e. the matrix in which our reality is floating, is composed, is renewed, as they said in Forbidden Planet, microsecond to microsecond to microsecond. And again, this is the geometry. The key number to remember here, which is kind of like a code, it's like shorthand. You remember the old joke about the two guys are in prison, and one guy, he's a new guy, and he comes in, and there's a whole bunch of guys in the mess hall, and they're sitting around, and they've had, dinner or whatever they call it, and they're basically waiting to go back to their cell. So what do? They tell stories and they tell jokes. And one guy says, 42, and everybody erupts into laughter. Another guy says, 37, and the other guy, what the hell's going on? Oh, well, we've heard the joke so many times we don't need to tell the joke, we just tell the number and everybody knows what it's about. That's what 19.5 is. It's a code. It's the code that lets you know they're talking about hyperdimensional physics with all its manifestations, all its implications, all its amazing multidimensional reality implications. 19.5. And there are various variants of it, like 33 is related. I don't have time to show you how, but it's in Dark Mission. It's on the web. Just go look. 11 or 1111 is another. It's a code for 19.5. So whenever you start seeing these numbers in connection with events, given how ritually bound NASA is, they're talking about hyperdimensional physics. I mean, for God's sake, the first spacecraft we sent to Mars to land, little Pathfinder, the microwave oven-sized little robot with the wheels that went and looked at this and looked at this, and it went and landed at 19.5 degrees on Mars inside a tetrahedron. They're telling everybody publicly, but of course, unless you follow the real stuff, the real work, the real code breaking, you won't have a clue. Of course, if you read Enterprise, you read Dark Mission or Monuments of Mars, yes, you will have clues, lots of them. So, getting back to Arthur's monolith. I mean, this was such an amazing breakthrough when I realized what he was doing. According to the story, reported in 71 in the book about the making of 2001, I forget, it was a Dell paperback, and I forget who wrote it, but it was It's very insightful. I would find it on Amazon or eBay or some used bookstore. Go find The Making of 2001 and read with these sets of glasses. You'll be astonished at what you're going to learn. Because Kubrick says in there, the same Kubrick, by the way, in his Playboy interview, who could give chapter and verse about Brookings, back when nobody, including me, had a clue about what the Brookings report was really trying to tell us, he knew it by heart. Why? Because he and Arthur and several others I could name, if I had time, are part of an in crowd. They're part of a, I'd almost willing to say priesthood. I now know that Gene was one. I know that Isaac was one. I know Bob Heinlein was one. All the guys I grew up idolizing as I was a kid, you know, teenager, reading science fiction, and then, wonder of wonders, I actually got to work with them. We became friends. And I had no idea they had these private, secret lives that they were leading, that their stuff that we were all reading and lapping up and thinking about was in fact part of a plan to lay out a vision for the future where humans could be human again and get out of this primeval morass, this swamp that someone is trying to push our face down into the mud and keep us there. And we must break out of prison, otherwise the future is without hope. And in the next few weeks, we have what we had at that moment when we were able to name Enterprise. We have a window of opportunity where if enough of our voices connected by Facebook and Twitter and the other media all get together and in unison demand that what's being shown on television and on these computer images actually be made present in the world, the so-called real world, the mainstream world of CNN and Fox and MSNBC and ABC and CBS and the Wall Street Journal and Murdoch, etc. If we demand to be made public, we have a shot at changing the river, because what's coming, and I'll show you in a minute what's coming, is so potentially transformative and has been anticipated for so long that, as my mother used to say about the relationship between my father and her, you know, the last for which the first was made. We can do this, but we have to realize that we're running out of time, and we have to be serious, and if we do it all together, we can win, because there's so much more of us than them. And obviously somebody is helping. Otherwise, why would we have these images? So I looked at this dimensions of the monolith, and I looked at this geometry. Now notice the difference between this one and the previous one. I'll go forward here. There are circumscribed tetrahedra, meaning a sphere with the tetrahedron inside it. Then there's superscribed tetrahedra, where the sphere is on the outside and the planet or the ball or the sphere is on the inside. And there's a mathematical relationship, and I won't bore you with the details. It's all here, and it's on the website, and just Google, you know, Enterprise and Arthur Clarke and the geometry of the monolith, and you'll find it. Bottom line, the mathematics of the monolith are in fact an elegant tetrahedral coding of the mathematics of the circumscribed tetrahedron, which is the code to the gating between dimensions of energy and information, and obviously us. Consciousness is not just a 3D phenomenon. We are beings that live other places simultaneously. And in dreams, in that state, we are somehow able to communicate with our, coining a term, higher selves. Why higher? Because it's a higher dimensional state space. That's all it means. It's a more complexified reality in a higher dimension. Bottom line, the 1 by 4 by 9, the squares of 1 and 2 and 3, is in fact another code for a tetrahedron in 3D, which is a gate significator between dimensions, for energy flow between dimensions, a hyperdimensional code for that reality that transfers between dimensions. The monolith, which was made to look like a door, a 1 by 4 by 9 door, is in fact a metaphor for a door between dimensions. So with this I realized Arthur knew. There's no way yet we never had this conversation in words, because it was not time. It was not allowed. Now it comes to this bizarre thing coming out of the dark, which has occasioned such inordinate fear and loathing and pushback and all kinds of absurd and obscene fear porn all over the internet. The coming of Elanine, the destroyer, the thing that's going to smash the earth, Nibiru, dwarf planets, invisible moons, you name it, every conceivable lie about this little object is out there, all about an object which is, under normal circumstances, just one of 100 of these type objects that come through the inner solar system every year. Yet somehow this object has been fastened upon by every fear monger on the planet, all of which seem to have very, very lucrative YouTube accounts. And it's out there that we should fear and loathe and run like hell, and there's no place to run to anyway, so it's all over. The end is here. It's the end times. It's the end of life. It's the end of the planet. And I look at this and I said, what the hell is going on? What could it be about this little thing, this little burgy bit, which is like 100 others that come through the inner solar system every year that nobody cares about except for astronomers that kind of track these things? Because if you spot a comet, you know, everybody has an ego, right? You get to name it after yourself. It's the one thing on the planet that you get to name after yourself by planetary acclamation, by the rules, by a coordinated consensus of the guys that do this stuff, and is recognized anywhere on the planet. Oh, that's Comet Elanine, named after Leonid Elanine, who, yes, is a real guy. This is Leonid Elanine on Moscow television. He's a young guy. He's only in his 30s. Back when he was around 10 or so, he got really zapped by astronomy like I did. And he didn't get a telescope because he was poor. You know, a lot of Russians are very poor. Most still are very poor. So he didn't get a telescope until, you know, a few years ago. And he didn't discover his comet with his own telescope because of the era of the internet. He was able to go to the internet and, by means of an electronic connection from his laptop in his little apartment in Moscow, all the way halfway around the world to a place called Maryhill, New Mexico, he was able to rent time on a telescope and run it, operate it by remote control from Moscow. And here he is with a Moscow TV guy, who is even younger than he is, showing on his laptop one of the images of what he found in December of 2010, December 10th, 2010, using this telescope. This is an 18-inch measures the diameter of the mirror. Obviously, it's longer because you have to bring it to a focal length and put detectors and CCD cameras and all that. It sits in a shed, in a wood shed, and it's operated by remote control. So you can literally, with a telescope, you can punch, you know, keys and open with motors the roof, point the telescope, take images, load them down to the computer, which is located somewhere on the side. You're not seeing all the cables here. And then literally via the internet, ship those images, digital images at the speed of light, back to Moscow. And lo and behold, this is what Elanine saw, this little fuzzy twink. Now, the dots represent images of stars. Why are they separate images? Which, of course, the fear-mongering crowd said, oh, those are super spaceships coming to eat the Earth. No, those are time-lapse images, 4 of them, representing the rotation of the Earth and the time that the telescope was taking these pictures. And what you do is you superimpose the comet image on image on image to stack. It's called image stacking, to drive down the noise and drive up the signal. And in that period of time, of course, the sky moves. So the stars, because the comet is moving separate from the stars. The comet is orbiting. It's moving through space. Even in the couple hours where he took the images, it had moved, even at the distance of halfway to Jupiter, which is how far out it was when it was photographed by Elanine. It had moved so that the stars appear as 4 separate images, whereas the comet appears as the little fuzzy ball it is. And at this distance, the coma, or the fuzz, the gas is escaping from whatever this thing is. And I say whatever, because it's not a normal comet, as I will show you very shortly. They're what escape and cause light scattering, so you have a bright object that is basically shining by reflected sunlight. And the size of this coma, even when he first photographed it in December of last year, was bigger than the size of Jupiter, over 80,000 miles across. Now, that's not the object inside, which he estimates based on comet models, which, of course, I think are useless in this case, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that you're not seeing the real object, what they call the nucleus in cometary paleontology and nomenclature, but you're seeing the fuzzball, the coma of escaping gases. Now, at the moment, we don't know what those gases are. We're hoping, because a few days ago, this comet went within 4.5 million miles of Stereo B, which is a NASA satellite. I'll show you that in a minute. And they got very good spectral information, and so we should get composition data as to what is being emitted by this object. That could tell us a lot more, depending upon whether this is being deliberately released to, shall we say, give a signature that would provide some people with clues as to what it really is. But back to the fear porn mongers, this is what they've made out of Leonid Elenin. They've turned his name into, a catchphrase. It's extinction level event, which came of course from the movie Deep Impact. Or it's Nibiru in November, which is the code name for the planet that Sitchin has been talking about for decades. And people are, the YouTube nonsense is so incredibly pervasive. I began looking at this and I said, okay, there's got to be a political reason for this overwhelming fear porn to counter something. In mainstream politics, you don't see this kind of a campaign unless somebody's trying to convince a group of people to think one way when in fact they're thinking another way. And there's like a moment where you can seize their consciousness, their attention, and divert it like 9/11. 9/11 was a classic example of taking something that Arthur and Stanley had painted as a stunning potential breakthrough for human consciousness and turn it into something of fear and loathing and dread and a nightmare for the last 10 years, where we are sick to death of discussions of terrorists and terrorism and bombs and lines and magnetometers and scans and all that crap. Someone took control of the conversation and have dictated our reality for 10 years, an entire decade. Now we're coming up to another possibility for changing the conversation, and somebody is even more aggressively determined not to allow us to breathe or to think or to dream or to look at other possibilities, but to inculcate overwhelming fear against something. And my logic says if there's that much energy being devoted to the dark side, maybe, just maybe, what's coming is the light side. And the dark side is in fear and is desperately trying a last-ditch rearguard effort to keep us in chains, in prison, to keep us constrained. In other words, this is a war for our hearts and minds and souls about what might be possible, what could happen in the next few months, which is going to be antithetical to all the absurd nonsense going on, up to and including the nonsense going on in Washington, which has become even a joke to people who never pay attention to politics, with words like ridiculous, bullshit, et cetera, people who would never get caught, getting actively involved in politics or looking at this and saying, this is nuts. This is not what the Founding Fathers envisioned. This is not thinking of people and the country and consensus and the betterment of humankind, the betterment of the majority of people. It's basically about ego and posturing and the next election. And as I've said over and over again, the physics, the hyperdimensional physics, as it keeps changing, is mandating that the polarization we're seeing get worse and worse and worse and worse. So, to use a kind of a catchphrase, the good are getting better and the bad are getting worse. And it's so obvious now which is which. It doesn't take a scorecard. The lies, it's like a Jim Carrey movie, Liar, Liar, which was brilliant. We're seeing it on television. The liars can't lie. The lies keep falling apart. And the games, even though they're more complex, it's clear that there are games going on. to where even people who would never imagine conspiracies or that there'd be hidden agendas or people doing things beyond what you can read in the headlines or see on the evening news, they're beginning to realize it's all a game, and the game has nothing to do with all the rest of us. It's all about them. And that's when things can change. As Robin was out the other night proving by handing out flyers about Anonymous in weird downtown Albuquerque, which after dark you don't want to kind of hang around, except the good news is there's a cop on every corner. So the fear porn around Elanine is that something like this, something smashing into the earth with the devastating energy of 1,000 H-bombs or something is going to be coming along in the tail of this thing. The outrageous claims with zero evidence, or Nibiru, horrifying after 2012, exclusive by this turkey, whoever that turkey is, okay? Or this is a frame grab from Deep Impact, showing what would happen with a huge tidal wave created by a 6-mile-wide object smashing into the Atlantic Ocean. And remember that final scene where she and her father, played by Omar Sharif, are standing there on the beach, and the wave is coming toward them. And, of course, further up the coast, you have this, which is the wave inundating New York, skyscrapers tipping over. Fear, 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 fear porn. What is all this about? I think this is laying the groundwork for when Elanine becomes the worst kept secret on the planet. All it's going to take now is one serious story, either in CNN or ABC, or it doesn't matter who, because everybody else will immediately glom onto the serious story. And then what will people do? Millions of people who would never be caught dead sitting here listening to me rant and rave and ramble on. They will rush to this thing, their computer. They will Google. Google is suddenly their best friend. Fearfully impelled because they've heard awful things, they will Google, and they will come up with Google searches that go on for page after page after page with this kind of fear porn. And it's all, if I'm right, by design. Someone is laying groundwork for when this cannot be kept secret, and this will be what they will be told in multiple ways, by multiple sources, by multiple nitwits who have nothing better to do than to spread it. And I don't think all of them are amateurs. I think it's being manufactured and controlled. It is a campaign. It's being funded because it's designed to completely saturate the search engines. So when someone Googles Elanine, they will get the worst of the worst, and they'll run screaming into the night and try to, like in Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds back in the 30s, they'll try to head for high ground because they will see these images, and it will be real to them because it will be on YouTube, which is the equivalent of my friend Gene Roddenberry's prescription. Dick, if it's real, it will be on television. The internet is now right up there with television. Again, all because of this little thing way out there in the dark, which is a fraction of the size of this city. It's 2 miles across, maybe. Frankly, I think it's a lot smaller and a lot more interesting, but be that as it may. Now, it was all of this in the political analysis I've just gone through that made me say, look, if there's all this humongous effort to get us to run screaming at the words Elanine, what is someone trying to conceal? And is there any clue in the published data that would tell us what the agenda might be? So I turned to the public data source, which is this source. This is the small body database browser at JPL. Someone said, oh, come on, Holly, you're trusting the government? Yes, and this is why. Because NASA does not manufacture this data. NASA is a clearinghouse of this data. If you look carefully over here, let me see if I can show you. This data has been compiled as of this date. This was on the 29th of July. Over 2,200 separate observations from all over the planet by all kinds of amateurs like Elanine. Only these guys, a lot of them have their own telescopes, or they're renting time like at Mary Hill, etc. Or they're, they have friends at telescopes and they've got the camera expertise, and some guys got a computer expertise. They put all their expertise together, and it's like they're out there taking pictures, and they send this data to NASA and to Harvard, to the small body group at Harvard, where my friend Brian Marsden used to run it until he ceremoniously up and died a few years ago, and now, of course, I don't have Marsden to talk to about this. He would have some very interesting things to say, because we all lived through the Hale-Bopp fiasco. And I'm now beginning to wonder about Hale-Bopp. Was Hale-Bopp another manufactured incident so people can use that as the model of what's coming? And they'll immediately go to the fear porn part, the 39 people who died. Didn't anybody ever kind of wonder why it was 39? Which is twice 19.5. And Applewhite was CIA. We know that. Is it possible that Hale-Bopp was kind of like New Haven? Now, you have no idea here what I mean when I say New Haven. In the States, we have Broadway plays. Broadway plays need places to be bad, to test out ideas that don't work, playwrights that are lousy, that suck. It used to be that playwrights and backers would try out a play with sets and costumes and everything, you know, the big deal, but they do it in a little town outside of New York in Connecticut called New Haven, where Yale University is located. If it worked in New Haven, then you brought it to Broadway. You brought it into New York, the big time. Was Hale-Bopp the New Haven of fear porn for Elanine? One question that I don't have an answer to, but I'm thinking that it certainly fits the pattern. So I'm looking at this data, and I'm starting to see, well, this is kind of weird, because there's all kinds of indications from the numbers that Elanine is not, in fact, a random natural incident. Like, down here at the bottom, close approach to Earth. And you got a whole series of numbers. I'm going to enlarge this so you can easily see it. Look at this number right here. On the 16th of October, a few months from now, at 1951 hours, Greenwich Mean Time, 19.5, Elanine zips closest to the Earth at 22 million miles. 19.5? Wait a minute. What are the odds of that? Statistically, how can that happen? You've got a little Bergy bit orbiting the sun. It could be in any orbit, any inclination, any distance, and all that. And it's supposed to arrive closest to the Earth at a 19.5 moment in time? That's pretty bizarre. So I started trying to model how one would do a calculation to estimate the odds of that happening just by accident. This is what you do. If you take 24 hours in a day times 60 minutes, in other words, that gives you the moment, the probability of any 1 hour and minute that this thing would come by. And the odds are like over 1,000 to 1 against that being just chance. Now, if I had 1,000 to 1 odds in my favor and I went to Vegas, Robin and I would never have to work again. Of course, I would anyway, at least that's what she says. But it would be pretty cool if you knew anything you were doing, you had 1,000 to 1 odds that you would succeed. You know, meet somebody, 1,000 to 1 odds, they'll, you know, go home with you that night. Hey, I'll take those odds. 1,000 to 1 odds, you go see a new car and you're going to wind up driving away with it and not have to pay anything down. I mean, 1,000 to 1, and I'm underestimating deliberately, okay? If you had 1,000 to 1 consistently in your favor, you would own the world. The first number, this thing comes by Elanine, so, you know, it was like old, you know, Art's New Year's predictions. Ding, 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 ding. This, numerically, is not an ordinary kind of object, because that number is this number. We now have attached, with odds of 1440 to 1, a hyperdimensional signature to this object. So I thought, okay, let's look further. Oh, well, it didn't take, I mean, Google is your friend. It took literally 10 seconds. Like, here is from the Minor Planets Center at Harvard, where Brian Marsden used to run, back when I was, you know, running up, down, and we were good friends. It lists Elanine's initial discovery plates and how bright the comet was on those photographs I showed you. And for those of you who can't see this, it was 19.5 magnitude. Now, come on. Give me a break. That's not possible. That tells me several interesting things. That Leonid Elenin could not have just randomly spotted this object, which, remember, swings by the Earth at 19.5 Greenwich Mean Time on the 16th. Could not have done it randomly and had his discovery images see it when it was, I mean, 19.5 magnitude is very, 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 very dim. It's like over 1 million times dimmer than you can see with the unaided human eye. So, okay, what are the odds that those two numbers are just chance? Well, we can calculate. I mean, here you got this little Bergy thing way out. This is Comet McNaught, okay, just to show you the splendor and the vastness of the universe. Think big. Think really, 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 really big. And I'm going to show you some other clues so you can actually put this in perspective. The odds of this all going on just because it had nothing better to do and decided all by itself, no. Little Elenin is coming at us from a discovery moment in time when it was at 19.5 magnitude to swing past the Earth exactly when it's 19.5 Greenwich time. So, you take the brightest comet ever seen in modern history, which was Akiyoseki. The magnitudes are plus and minus. Minus is very bright, plus is dimmer. So Venus is like -4 when it's really kind of close. The moon is -12.6. The sun on this scale is -26, almost -27. So it's a logarithmic scale, and it's used by astronomers, amateurs, and professionals all over the world. Has been for centuries. The dimmest object seen was Halley, because we know exactly where it is, plotting an orbit, seen by Hubble a few months ago at plus 28.2. So the spread between those two is a range of 45.2 magnitude. I could have expanded the scale. I could have said the dimmest object one's ever seen and the brightest object one's ever seen. I could have cheated and used that, but I stuck with just comet observations to try to limit the numbers so that it's realistic, it makes sense. That spread is 45. So the odds of 19.5 coming up on discovery is like 1 in 45, right? But odds, you don't add odds, you multiply odds. Multiply, multiply, multiply. So you have to take the previous odds and you now multiply them by this set of odds, and you do it this way. 24 hours times 60 minutes, 1440, times 45.2 gives you now 65,000 plus to 1 that Elenin is doing this by chance. 65,000. That means you'd have to discover a comet 65,000 times just to get one that would do this. That's more comets that have been discovered in the entire history of astronomy, right there. 65,000 comets have not been discovered by any astronomers, any institutions, any observatories, any government agencies in the history of astronomy, going back hundreds of years. Just not that many comets have been discovered. But, as they say in the old Rinko ads, there's more. So you do this. You start looking now at the JPL applet. JPL is a really cool applet on its website that allows you to play around with the trajectory of any of these objects, comets, asteroids, whatever. You can play with it on your computer. You can tilt it. You can look at it at various angles, move around the solar system, look at it from this angle, look at it from the top down, from the bottom up, you know. So you look at this trajectory, and at the moment that Elenin is going to be closest to the sun, it turns out it is September 11th. Whoa. Come on. That's not possible. There are 365 and change days in a year. So now we're back to odds. How do you get an object? And now there have been some critics who argued to me that, oh, but it's not September 11th in Greenwich, therefore you're cheating, you're lying. No, September 11th in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Hong Kong, it doesn't matter. September 11th was a defining moment for the planet. Not just one little piece of the planet. Everybody's life was changed because of the horrors of 9/11. So the idea that this object could come by the sun when one part of the planet was actually already in September 11th on the 10th anniversary, the 10th anniversary, is just it's cuckoo. Unless someone is driving the train. Watch. So what you do now, here's some more odds. 365 times 65,000 plus times 10. The odds now are 230 million and change to 1 against this being an accident. Now at this point, if I had those odds, I would own every one of you and everybody on Earth and the whole planet. I could not lose. That is such a virtual certainty that you would live lifetimes with those odds, doing everything, and you would never be wrong. You would never fail. You'd never lose money. You'd never lose in a relationship. You'd never lose anything. This is virtual certainty. And all I've done is do some very simple elementary calculations that anybody can duplicate, and you'll see there's nothing wrong with the logic. This thing has been designed. It has been sent to us by someone from somewhere at some time for some amazing purpose. And it will pass no closer than 22 million miles. So it's not the fear porn of collision. It's not going through the tail, because we went through the tail of Halley's Comet in 1910 and nothing happened. In space, you know, a vacuum is so incredibly vast that any amount of gases, even if it were total cyanide, emitted from some comets do emit cyanide, which is very lethal. Zero happens because of the dilution factor. The solution to pollution is dilution. Well, in space, you've got billions of cubic miles to empty stuff into with zero, you know, like one molecule here, and 5 miles away, one molecule there, and 20 miles away, another molecule. In other words, there's no problems with something passing 22 million miles away. It's not going to hit us. It's not going to poison us. It's not going to blind us. It's doing nothing that the YouTube videos claim. And they're lying. And the reason is, well, what is the reason? Because if you look at the solar system, okay, things are about to get even more interesting. Here's our classic solar system. You got the plane of the planets, like a dinner plate. I don't have a ready analog here. I can maybe use this. I mean, the solar system is essentially flatter than a sheet of paper on this scale. Incredibly flat, except for Pluto, the dwarf planet, newly named, which orbits at 17.2 degrees to the plane of the rest of the planets, including the Earth. So the next question was, okay, the inclination. What's the tilt of Elenine's orbit to the plane of the planets? That number is located right here. I, inclination. 1.839547814025426. That's how accurate the orbit plots now with multiple thousands of observations. There's zero uncertainty in these numbers. I mean, we're talking seconds in terms of flying by the Earth, out of days, weeks. So here's another calculation. You take this, you divide 360 degrees, which is the total number of degrees in a circle. You divide 1.84, we'll round it off to 1.84, into 360. What do you get? You get 195. Okay? 19.5. This is getting a little bit weird. Someone has sent us this to tell us something profound, and the central message is hyperdimensional physics. Hyperdimensional physics, hyperdimensional physics. Well, besides planets and stars and solar systems, what else runs on hyperdimensional physics? What is it that is consciousness but hyperdimensional connection to us in higher dimensions? This thing is telling us something profound about consciousness, and there's a whole body of people out there who run the world who are freaking out and trying to get us to think awful thoughts when in fact we should be thinking exactly the opposite. They're trying, like in 9/11, to take control of the conversation. And whoever sent us this thing is doing it because they want to basically, I believe, set us free. But we have to be the ones to make ourselves free. All they're doing is giving us the clues. Now, there may be some other stuff, and I'll get into some speculation in a minute here. But let's look at the total odds now. You're going to love the total odds, okay? The odds now of this little thing being an accident are 44 billion to 1. 44 billion to 1. Actually, it's closer to 45, but who's counting? Obama was the 44th president. I thought 44 was kind of nice. So alanine is artificial. We've just shown you by the numbers it cannot be anything else but artificial. Now, what do I mean by artificial? Is it a ship? Is it a lot of these guys all tied together with string, baling wire, duct tape? Or is it a natural object like a real comet, a Bergy bit, a fragment maybe of Tom Van Planner's exploded planet, to basically be a reminder of what people can do when they are really dumb and stupid and blow a solar system apart and lose everything they once had and grovel in the mud trying to climb back up so they can kill somebody else to have more stuff? Is that what the meta message here is? We don't know. It hasn't played out yet. But it's not going to be years, decades. It's going to be weeks. In weeks from tonight, we will know so much more than we know now. And the fear porn is going to become astronomical, pun intended. Because the pushback is getting fevered and more fevered because they're losing control. And I'm watching all the other weird shit, which we'll edit out of the tape, hit the fan, like the debt crisis, like the 1.25 trillion or something, or 2 trillion we lost in Europe the other day. I'm watching all the mainstream institutions kind of crumbling and tottering, and I'm saying, okay, change with a capital C is coming in this window, and someone is trying to give us this avenue, and someone else is trying to keep us down to this avenue. And the choice, it's all about ultimately free will. The choice is going to be ours. So then I look at the next little data point. On the JPL site, this again is the database browser, it's listed as a hyperbolic comet. Now, why is that intriguing? Because there ain't no such animal. In the entire history of astronomy, which goes back hundreds of years, and if you count the Chinese and their visual observations, but of course they didn't really have accurate telescopes and they couldn't get position measurements very well, so we can't really tell from those measurements whether what I'm going to say next was true. But there has never been in astronomical history a bona fide, unequivocal, uncontested observation of a hyperbolic comet. What do I mean by hyperbolic? It's very simple. This represents the sun. Most comets we see are orbiting in various periods of time, be it hundreds of years, thousands of years, or whatever. A hyperbolic comet is something that comes in from interstellar space, from here, from the galaxy, from the stars. It has never been here before. It will never be here again. It's a one-time visitor. What are the odds that a one-time visitor, never ever seen before, is going to have all these hyperdimensional tetrahedral parameters that keep coming up 19.5, 19.59? Well, obviously, it's absurd. It's impossible. It's at the moment 44, 45 billion to 1. But here's another paradox. Leonid Alanine, who was a mathematician, remember he works at this mathematics institute outside Moscow, whose name I can't pronounce, so I decided not even to try. He has calculated that alanine is not a hyperbolic object. And in the world of astronomy, a discoverer's word is taken seriously. So it's like we've got this weird this contradiction going on. Why does NASA keep claiming it's hyperbolic and alanine says it is this? It has, in fact, a 13,000-year period, and this is the shape of the orbit. It goes, whips in very close to the sun, inside, well, just outside the orbit of Mercury. Then it takes 6,000+ years to go all the way out here past the orbit of Sedna. What is Sedna? Sedna is a minor planet. Here's a closer view. This is Sedna. Well, I'm coming up on Sedna. Here's Sedna, all right? It's around 1,100 miles across. It's like, you know, Pluto, smaller than Pluto, much smaller than the moon, much, much smaller than the Earth. But it's another one of these dwarf planets way, way out there. It's like 10,000, takes 10,000 some years to go around. This thing goes out even further, according to Alanine himself, than the orbit of Sedna, which the astronomers have said cannot be explained by any known celestial mechanics process. They have no idea. Mike Brown, who's the guy at Caltech who discovered Sedna using the 200-inch telescope many years ago, he can't explain why it's there. It should not be there, yet it is there. Well, Mike won't go where I'm going to go, but I think somebody put it there. Which gets us to the next part. Is it possible that this object is in a specifically tailored orbit with this specific period to tell us something profound in terms of the orbital period? Why is 13,000 years important? Well, it turns out that 13,000 years is just about half of a crucial astronomical cycle called the precessional cycle, the time it takes for the Earth spinning on its axis like this to nod once and realign in terms of external celestial reference points like the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And you know where I'm going, right? Because that period, that orbital period, is half of the precessional cycle, meaning that Elenine was here 13,000 years ago, the last time we had an orientation between the Earth, the Sun, and the center of the galaxy, only 180 degrees reverse. Now, why is that orientation important? Because that's the basis in John Major Jenkins, a guy who I'm going to talk to you about in a second, of his entire work, his masterwork, relating the Mayan calendar with the orientation of the Earth and Sun and the center of the Milky Way in the literature, in the Mayan literature, marking the precise end date of the 13th Baktun of the Mayan long count. In other words, the 2012 problem. Oh, and something else that's really weird. The count is synchronized so that it ends exactly at 11:11 a.m. GMT on the 21st. And remember, 11:11 is a hyperdimensional code for 19.5. So Pope Gregory, and actually the German mathematician who led his team of mathematicians who refigured the Julian calendar and gave us the Gregorian calendar, which we live under right now, was named Clavius, which is why Arthur and Stanley put the base on the moon in 2001 in Clavius. It gets better. Watch. So if you stood behind the Earth on the morning of December 21, 2012, a year and a half from now, here's the Earth, Sun right behind it, North Pole, tilted away from the Sun. You'd see the whole Milky Way laid out like this. You'd see the constellations of Scorpio and Libra, and you'd see planets, Mercury, Venus. You'd see the bright star Antares, brilliant red giant star a few hundred light years away. And it's at that moment that John Major Jenkins, in his masterwork called Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, discovered in the classic Mayan literature that in fact, that moment seems to be memorialized in the calendar to where the Mayans themselves were actually indicating that something interesting was coinciding celestially in the sky to the end of their calendar on the ground. And he drew the obvious conclusion, expanded in this work called Galactic Alignment, where he found other examples both in the Mayan, the Egyptian, and the Vedic traditions. And the Vedic traditions are, of course, Indian. Okay? He found that this alignment appears to be the trigger for something in these disparate mythologies all around the world synchronized to this physical alignment of the Earth and the center of the galaxy with the Sun in between, which is where we come in. Because my work, the work of Enterprise, the work of my colleagues, has all been about looking at the effect of planetary alignments in the torsion field, which is a twisting of space-time by the rotation of objects. Remember, the three laws of hyperdimensional physics are rotation, rotation, rotation. Any spinning object creates tremors in the force, ripples in space-time that can communicate information, communicate energy, and most critical, open doorways where information energy comes in from another state space, a higher dimension, and appears in our midst. Here is the description by Paul Muriad at the DoD in 2005. He talks about the Russians' work. He talks about how it's related to rotations of bodies, that you can get these kinds of effects from torsion, like influencing adjacent rotating bodies. Well, what is this but the foundation of what I call a hyperdimensional solar system, where all the planets are spinning. They're all moving around the Earth, or around the Sun, rather, including the Earth, which is spinning. All these spinning systems are creating ripples in the force, ripples in space-time, and they interact with each other in ways that ultimately wind up interacting with the galaxy, which is 400 billion stars, each of which is spinning, all of them rotating around the galactic center. So that's another rotation. So it's spinning and rotating and spinning and rotating, interplaying systems, all interacting, causing changes in these systems because of communication through the hyperfield, the torsion field, with each other, even across thousands of light years of space, because torsion is not limited to the speed of light, it's essentially instantaneous. And that's been proven by experiments in Russian labs, and I don't have time to go into it. But here's where it all comes together. Because in the ancient Hopi tradition, they talk about in prophecy when the blue star Kachina makes its appearance in the heavens, the fifth world will emerge. This will be a day of purification. The Hopi name for the star Sirius is the blue star Kachina. The fifth world then will begin, and with it will come the blue star Kachina dancing in the plaza and removing his mask. This is metaphor for truth time. The good are getting better, the bad are getting worse, the lies are falling away. We're seeing by the presence of people who must remove their masks the real events, the real people, the real agendas, the truth impelled by this physics. Well, who were the Hopi? Well, the Hopi turn out to be descendants of the Anasazi, a name you will find if you go to the new movie coming out called Cowboys and Indians. Forget the plot of the movie, but the history is kind of interesting. They were connected to the Maya down here and have huge reservations and native people reservations now, pueblos, up in our neck of the woods in Arizona and New Mexico. Back in the 40s, a guy named Frank Waters wrote a book about the Hopi. It's a classic work. This is a description of the sun symbol, common throughout the ancient Americas. Each of the four rays represents the four worlds, ages of the world that had been punctuated by disasters that had destroyed civilizations of previous ages. Now we're getting to the good part, because here's the close-up. The most recent disaster, according to the Hopi cosmology, was a global flood which the Hopi had escaped by following a star to an underground cave, waiting for the waters to subside, emerged later to repopulate the world. The Hopi believe we are now living at the end of the fourth and final age before the fifth world dawns. So question, could Elenine, in fact, be the Hopi blue star Kachina? And I think the data is tending to indicate it is. So that brings up the question, has it been presaged by more New Havens? In 2007, when Robin and I were in New York and I was doing the press conference of the National Press Club for the Dark Mission, which had just come out, that was the same day that NASA launched the Discovery Space Shuttle. That night at 11:11 p.m., this happened in the outer solar system. Between the orbits of Jupiter and Mars, this little comet called Holmes, which had been known for hundreds of years, suddenly blew up, and in the space of a few hours became 1,000,000 times brighter. And no one yet has figured out why. I mean, there's no reason why there's something out there should do that, because it's so far from the sun, it's very cold, there's nothing for it to run into. The timing, which to me was really interesting, was, I mean, it almost looked as if someone was using it as a test bed to kind of test the visual impact if they did something with a big natural object, a mile or two across, and made it expand. I mean, eventually, the cloud of stuff that came off Holmes was bigger than the sun. Was it New Haven for Elenine? What would happen on October 16th with Elenine here and Earth here, with perfect pre-dawn viewing, if suddenly it became 1,000,000 times brighter than it is now? It would become visually the Hopi blue star. It would be a visual sign in the heavens. Together with all the mathematics, it would strongly influence an awful lot of people, because remember, it passes close to the Earth at 1905 Greenwich Mean Time. So here's where we are. Alanine is clearly artificial, with odds of at least 44, 45 billion to 1 against chance. It has arrived back in a 13,000-year period, according to Alanine himself, clearly timed to coincide with the end of the 13 Baktun of the Mayan long count. But which interpretation of that long count? A few weeks ago, Robin and I had the pleasure of being on a cruise, the cruise into 2012 with Carl Kalaman, who is a very interesting guy. I don't have time to go into his background. Google him and you'll see he's a very interesting guy. He believes, and has written down in this tome, which Whitley really, really likes, and I like it in spite of the fact that Whitley really likes it. It's a long story. He believes that what we're looking at in terms of the Mayan calendar has nothing to do with planetary bodies. In other words, he's really against Jenkins. He thinks it's all a matter of evolution of consciousness, spiritual times, growth of the individual, connectedness to universal content, all of this stuff. In other words, even though he was trained as a biologist, as a hard scientist, he eschews all that and he's looking at a metaphysical thing, and I'm saying, but Carl, they're not incompatible. We had like, what, a week we were on the cruise? We had a really cool dinner. He's a really nice guy. We had a wonderful set of conversations. It's so new to him that he hasn't been able to wrap his mind around the idea of hyperdimensional physics and see how it relates to his own model, which is really interesting because it shows that even the most gifted and open person who's looking for answers, if it doesn't fit their narrow little mold, they can walk right by it and never even notice it. The HD model explains what he has been seeing in the data he's been looking at, and it actually is a synthesis of these two ideas. And of course, the big thing is, he's saying to John and saying to me and others, he said, well, why would the Mayan calendar end in December 21, 2012 when there's nothing going on, and the actual end of the calendar is in October 28th of this year? And the answer is very simple. Over hundreds or thousands of years, it's easy to miss a year. This is not 2011, it's some other date. We don't really know. I mean, it's, birth of Christ, there's a plus or minus 4 years, there's no year zero. It could easily be, quote, 2012. So there's nothing set in stone that these ideas are mutually incompatible with two sets of people doing the calendar translations in the Gregorian calendar and coming up with two separate dates. The fact is, I know I can prove it's the planetary physics that's driving the consciousness train. Robin and I actually went to Central America, a couple years ago now, at the behest of NBC, to get great pictures like this for our family album, as well as to carry out torsion field measurements of these astonishing structures, which, as I measured them using the little Accutron, and again, we don't have time to go into how it works, Google is your friend, I got astonishing changes in the vibration rate of the little 360 hertz tuning fork that's in the heart of every Accutron. Inertia is malleable, is changeable in this physics. It's overwhelmingly obvious that these pyramids, these amazing structures built by guys, I mean, it's claimed they're hundreds of years old. I think they're thousands. The mainstream people are completely lost in terms of chronology because they have no basis for judging. They think everything has to happen recently because we must have been really stupid before. And they don't understand that this was information that was given to the Mayas, not developed. It was a legacy, as John West says. It was not a heritage. So in a few days after the conference is over, Robin and I are going to go south, and I'm going to get a chance to actually measure the torsion field of Stonehenge and Avebury and maybe Old Sarum, to companion with the stuff we found in Central America, both in Tikal and Teotihuacan. It all comes down to this. It all comes down to waves. It comes down to interference patterns, as George Lucas gave us immortally, tremors in the force. The force is the ether. The force is the torsion field. The force is what allows communication, consciousness-wise, telepathy, precognition, whatever you want to call it, at billions of times the speed of light. That's slowpoke photonic travel of information through 3D reality. It's what connects. That's why you can have what's called the Bell non-locality, where a photon over here and a photon 5 light years away, if you jiggle this one, that one jiggles instantaneously. And the mainstream guys are tearing their hair out trying to figure out how the two can communicate, because there's nothing going in between them in 3D reality that allows them to communicate and one to know what the other is doing. Well, there is if you take a shortcut through hyperspace. That's the answer to the Bell inequality theorem. Ultimately, it is the explanation of this. Astrology is nothing but hyperdimensional physics that has been lost and is slowly being rediscovered and has had a lot of stupid stuff added to it because no one has the science and the ways of calibrating the real signal, the real information, the real pattern from the fake stuff. But they will as we get better. So now we're back to Kalaman. Kalaman posits these wonderful cycles. And toward the end of this cycle, you have all kinds of stuff hitting the fan, including, I mean, he has a whole bunch of other mythology he has created that I don't agree with, but the core of his belief is that these cycles are affecting consciousness is absolutely true. You can see it. Just watch television. You can see people are being forced to tell the truth. So, the modulating of this is occasioned by the rotation of the Earth and this 26,000-year nodding as the equatorial plane of the Earth goes backwards around the zodiac. The zodiac, from the Greek, the cycle of life. The Greeks knew this modulated life. And you change pole stars in the sky, and that's how the great year was born in Plato, et cetera, et cetera. Again, the referent is the center of the galaxy. The biggest, most interesting spinning mass in our neighborhood, spinning at something like 11 times per second. That's a kind of an interesting number. 26,000 light years away. And the alignment coming up in 2012 is proposed in Jenkins' model to somehow, a la the Mayans, to affect us all. Remember, John is not a fearmonger. John is looking at the positive side, that the Mayans were not talking about doom and gloom and catastrophe. They were talking about essentially a step function in consciousness, a whole new way of thinking, a rising out of the muck into what we're supposed to be living and breathing and visioning and seeing and experiencing, including a connectedness, an identification with each other that we're all part of one human family. Not a bunch of separate little countries and separate little isms and groups, but we're one. And that unity is the same thing that Kalaman is expressing in his work. But he doesn't seem to know where it comes from. He'll get on board at some point, because he's an honest guy looking for real answers. At least that's the way I assessed him on the cruise. Now this guy is interesting. This is James Flynn, who is a psychologist from New Zealand. And many, many years ago, he made a really amazing discovery. It's called the Flynn curve. He discovered, going back decades, back to much earlier than the 40s, but this is only the data they plotted in Scientific American, that global IQ scores all over the planet have been monotonically rising for decades. And no one can figure out why. Ostensibly, this set of graphs says we're all getting smarter. We'll look around and we know that's not true. So what is it really? I mean, Robin and I used to have these wonderful fights. Oh, it can't, she was right. Because it's something much more interesting. The way they measured this is you have what are called standardized tests. We all know about standardized tests. They go in the computer and the computer does the marking. They do it here at the university. They do it all over. It's an awful way to grade people's knowledge base. Because what it does, it gives you multiple choice. It gives you A, B, C, and D, and you're supposed to read the question, and then you're supposed to put down the answer. If you don't know the answer, they say, okay, guess. The first thing that you guess, put it down. That's the clue. Because the guessing is connectedness, is intuition, it's basically a tapping into the force, the ether, the torsion field, and you intuit, you glop on to the right answer. Even if you don't consciously with your left brain know the right answer, that's why they say use your first guess. And what's happening, I believe, in all these standardized tests is that the right guessing rate has been going up more and more and more as the torsion field physics has been changing in the solar system, and people are getting more connected, and they're making right guesses more often than they used to, and that's where this is going. This is an actual quantitative measure of the force, the field, the consciousness interconnectivity changing, even as we speak. And it's going up. Well, that gets into a whole bunch of other stuff we don't have time to go into. So we'll go to this one. With all that as background, who sent us Elenine and why? Well, we started getting answers a few days ago. As Elenine came into the solar system, like literally 3 or 4 days ago, on Tuesday, I believe, it crossed the orbit of the Earth. And it crossed it just behind one of these two spacecraft called Stereo A and Stereo B. This is SOHO, familiar SOHO? And what they are is spacecraft in Earth orbit behind and ahead, and the comet is going in like it's going to loop around the sun like that. It passed within 4.5 million miles of Stereo B, and they turned the spacecraft around beginning on the 31st of July, and they started taking a series of images. And this is NASA's official website, the Stereo website, showing this little, I mean, isn't that threatening? Isn't that overwhelmingly terrifying? My God, look at that. It's going to come, and oh, it's going to kill us. Can't even see it. So, I will amplify. There we are. There's Elenine. Little fuzzy speck. Millions and millions and millions of miles away. What I did find interesting is that the website, remember this? Here's the whole website. At the very bottom, there's a little list of who put it in place and who posted it and when and all that. So take a look at this. Aren't they clever? They could have posted this anytime. They posted it 195 because they know. There's no doubt in my mind they know. Now, this is really cool. This is Elenine. If you turn the image upside down and look at it a couple hours later, here's the little dot. Let me do this now. Watch this little dot right up here. This is Elenine. This is, oh, let's see. Let me go back. Here we are. Okay, here it is. In the hour or two between these two images, it moved. See it? Right there. That's it orbiting. Now this is really cool. Anybody recognize what this is? It's Orion. What's this? It's Sirius, the Hopi blue star Kachina. If you were on Earth and saw this, but you couldn't see it on Earth, you can only see it from Stereo B, it mimics the Hopi connection between Elenine and its blue star Kachina in the literature, in the myths, in the projections of what could be at the end of the fourth age and the beginning of the fifth. Now, this is on Elenine's own website. What he's done is to take and put false color the various bright stars. This is still Orion. This is now after, and I rotated it around and turned it so it's facing the right way. This is after Elenine went through. Elenine went right through the belt stars of Orion, which, if you know anything about our work and look at Dark Mission, is overwhelmingly important ritualistically inside NASA. Overwhelming. Here's another view. We'll go back. See, it is so dim you can't even see it move. If we magnify it, here it is up here, okay? See, move just a little bit in the time between these two pictures. It's a real thing. So what are we talking about? I think Elenine is Rama. I think Arthur Clarke, in another one of his amazing... Oh yeah, 10 minutes. Yep, less than 10. We're really close. 19.5, no. Arthur Clarke was an incredible guy. I feel so privileged and honored to know him, and I just wish he'd stuck around for the good part. But maybe it's better that he didn't, because we can talk about him and he won't tell me I'm wrong. This work, I commend it to everybody. Read it. It describes an object coming into the solar system on a hyperbolic trajectory, which turns out to be a 50-mile wide spaceship sent by somebody, a Type 2 civilization. A huge cylinder rotating for synthetic gravity. This is a group of astronauts who rendezvous with it in his novel, are able to gain access and go inside and try to discover why it has come here and what it's doing. And it mimics in eerie form the trajectory through Virgo, the hairpin turn around the sun, the journey back out toward the dark, where, by the way, from the Earth it will cross very close to Sirius and Orion again in the fall. In other words, this object, this tethered object in Ellenine's calculations, could be something sent to us by our own dim ancestors 13,000 years ago, in that civilization from which we are descendants, who had some problem, some enormous catastrophe happen to the world, to their civilization, their culture, and all we have left are bits and pieces and fragments of what they once were. And what they've been trying to do across time and space through generations, thousands upon thousands of generations, they've tried in all different ways, culminating now with Ellenine in this model, in this scenario, to send us a time capsule of not only what happened, but what we now can do to change history, to avert it, to stop the slide into oblivion that, if we're unaware of what could happen, will take place, and instead take control of our own future, our own fate. That's a model. That's not a projection, that's a model. Backed up by, all over the world, structures like this, which in other places in Egypt show things like this. This is at Abydos, a frieze on the wall showing eerie similarities to technology that we have only now, in this model, reinvented. 13,000 years later, the Egyptians talk about Zep Tepi the first time. And recently, an engineer from this university, from Leeds, named Robert Richardson, somewhere in the engineering department around here, actually was able to get the Egyptian government to give him permission, essentially the day that Zahi Hawass got canned because of legal problems. And he got inside and he got robotic pictures of strange pictographs on the floor in this tunnel that previous investigators like Gentenbrink had found like a decade ago, but never had permission from Hawass to go and explore. Richardson did. And these are very strange pictures. I didn't have time to put together what I wanted to do, which is to connect these real data, this new data, with some work that has been done by a friend of mine who has been looking at the possibility of very high-tech machining in ancient Egypt, that you do not have random tool marks on some of these astonishing statues and coffins and even pyramid stones. Instead, they appear to have been machined by an extraordinarily sophisticated high-tech technology. The same kind of technology which is evidenced here in the layout of the stones of Stonehenge, which are tetrahedral. I recommend you to consult the works of Karl Monk. And again, Rob and I are going south in a few days to actually measure the torsion field to see if the physics of this monument corresponds to the mathematics that are encoded in the layout. All over the world, we see this pattern of these ancient monuments. I am now almost convinced that someone left us this astonishing grid pattern, hyperdimensionally tuned and resonant to when the physics rose to a certain pitch, a certain frequency, a certain amplitude. It's supposed to resonate these structures all over the world, assisting in this change of human consciousness so that we can receive a message perhaps sent to us via this time capsule, if that in fact is what Ellenine turns out to be. We can call this era the Atlantean era, you know, the guys that came before, whatever you want to call it. I find it very interesting that the space agency that we now know so much more than we've ever thought they knew had an Atlantis shuttle, which they deliberately made the last shuttle of the entire sequence of 30-year histories of space shuttles. The 135th mission. Well, 135 subtracted from 195 gives you 60, a tetrahedral number. And the other night, the last shuttle flew over a set of ancient ruins, as I said, on coast, half a mile down under the Atlantic off the east coast of Cuba, and at 100,000 feet flew over its namesake, ruins which I believe, and others do too, like Paulina Zalitsky, are the surviving remnants buried a half a mile under the ocean off Cuba, between Cuba and the Yucatan, of what would have been called Atlantis. On October 16th, whatever this thing is, will pass closest to the Earth at 22 million miles, and if we could go out there, if we could somehow rendezvous with it, if we could somehow communicate with it, would it give us a code? Would it tell us something or some things profound? And can we find that code in, for instance, these ancient monuments, in the very layout of the stones? Could we use that if, for chance, a signal was heard coming from it? Well, there's two ways we could do that. They could be sending radio signals. I've asked on Coast for radio astronomers, amateurs and professionals, to listen to see if, in fact, El Anin is broadcasting. It could also send us laser signals. I mean, the technology for producing lasers and powering them with this kind of physics is trivial, and we could communicate in turn with it by means of giant telescopes that would be using lasers to fire back at it as it comes closest and maybe get some kind of a response. Maybe it will be waiting to see if there is some kind of signal from Earth on this trek around the sun when it comes back from its 13,000-year journey. Places like this, the New Mexico Observatory that El Anin himself used, could in fact be part of such a network. The fear porn, the overwhelming fear porn against this object, these kinds of images being conjured up for when the mainstream suddenly goes mainstream and begins to talk about this, reminds me of what happened the night before President Obama went to Oslo to receive his Nobel Peace Prize for something he himself admitted he had not yet done. A few days ago, something awful and tragic happened in Norway. A rabid idiot, a total fearmonger who killed almost 100 people, probably not with his own hand because he may have had help, appears on a website dressed up in Masonic regalia, like they're supposed to be part of the fear porn. In other words, if we're looking at a lineal progression of generations of scholars and a priesthood designed to preserve the information down through time to now when it would be useful, my bet would be the original Masonic tradition is the place to look for that preservation. As part of the politics of fear porn, part of the politics of the pushback, part of the politics of making us fear the very interpreters of the message that might be born in the next few weeks. This is part of the beginning of that campaign, would seem to fit the model. Perhaps fostered by these guys. If you read the works of Joseph Farrell, or you read the works of Dr. Dolan, or myself, you'll see that we talk a lot about the Nazi Internationale. The idea that if World War II, some of these technologies in physics were actually part of secret programs that were then carried on after the war and have now led to what we call a breakaway civilization of human beings spawned at the end of World War II, using this physics and technology and trying to keep the rest of us, as I said, on red ice, trapped here on Earth. If that's what's going on, then the masterminds behind this concerted campaign against El Anin makes a great deal more sense, as does poor Gary McKinnon and his plight. Because somehow, according to news reports going back now several years, he stumbled over decades ago evidence of a secret space program that was so mind-boggling that he frankly wasn't able to remember much detail at all, yet they clobbered the guy and threatened him with 70 years life in prison for basically being a computer hacker. Obviously a message, a terrible, chilling message for any who might follow Gary's example, only this time have a damn hard drive to record what they tapped into. It's not an accident that the swastika, which the Nazis appropriated as their key symbol, in fact goes all the way back to the Vedic tradition. It is a power symbol. It is a power of the spinning hyperdimensional vortex in the Hindu mythologies. It is the physics which the Germans the Nazis specifically, misappropriated and turned into another hate symbol, another trying to change the river, trying to poison the well against the positive messages that this symbol has enjoyed for thousands of years. Would they do any less now? Of course not. There is even evidence in the way of photographs that have come to me through various sources of technology of ships that look eerily, this one was poised over Clark Air Force Base in the 1970s, similar to the Horton flying wing that the Germans developed at the end of World War II, and which Farrell believes may be the basis, by control of gravity, of the actual real history of the Roswell crash. And he's written a very important book I commend to your attention called Roswell and the Reich, which will give you a lot of background for this idea, this model, this scenario. So, is there someone tonight knocking at the door of Elenine? And do they wear swastikas on their armbands? Are they representative of a small faction of this planet trying to secrete the information and knowledge left by our great ancestors themselves on a traveling times capsule which is supposed to come by and provide all of us something important? The answer could be in the JPL small database browser, because there's a peculiar line that attributes to the preparation of this whole ephemerid this peculiar character. And I looked at this and I thought, well, Google. So I did. This is what Automatic is. Automatic is a video game where you take on the role of a friendly robot who must save humanity from the evil brain aliens of Planet X. And because the aliens have taken humans to far-ranging planets, as you travel the game or move in the game, you have to travel the galaxy to rescue them. Many years ago, I discovered on one set of Apollo images this bizarre structure lying in a crater floor at the Apollo 17 landing site. It's either, we call it Data's head, or C-3PO, because it looks like this. It's eerily reminiscent of what George Lucas gave to us by way of his films. It almost tells me that there is, in fact, this secret group, this secret society, this secret enclave of those who have known and who in their life work have laid out a roadmap to what could be coming. Arthur first and foremost. In 2010, the year we made contact, there is a very important line. And remember, Elenine discovered the comet named after him in 2010, on December 10th. So technically, it conformed to Arthur's model. He said, something wonderful is coming. Is Elenine, in fact, not the fear porn we're being deluged with, but something wonderful? At the end of the novel, at the end of the book, Arthur writes, on far-off Earth, Dr. Carlisle Pereira, who was one of the explorers of Rama in the ship that made it there and made it back, had as yet told no one of how he had awakened from a restless sleep with a message from his subconscious echoing in his brain. The Ramans do everything in threes. Stay tuned.